The model village. My Uncle David was an eccentric man. That's not code to say he was some kind of deviant. In fact, he was a pleasant and caring man for most of his life. However, he was also a sensitive soul and not much of a people person. David never got married or had children. He lived alone his whole life and worked a dull job in the civil service. Yes, David was definitely an introvert and may have been on the spectrum, but he kept himself to himself and indulged in his unusual hobbies, some of which became obsessions. I guess that's why he bought the model village. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept, a model or miniature village is an attraction closely associated with the English countryside, although there are few left in existence in the 21st century. Some date back to the 19th century, but their popularity peaked from the 1930s to 1950s. Essentially, they are outdoor scale models turned into very detailed exhibits replicating towns or villages, containing everything from miniature churches, houses, railways, canals, and parks, and figurines representing small people, men, women, children, and even pets. The level of detail is impressive, and there's a quaint and almost magical feel to such attractions. But of course, like so much else, model villages have lost much of their appeal in the modern digital age, unable to compete with more contemporary leisure pursuits and venues. The few which remain retain their quintessential charm and appeal, but their heyday is long gone. Uncle David couldn't have foreseen this trend when he purchased his own model village in the early 1990s, although I doubt it would have stopped him, as he never regarded the attraction as a financial enterprise. I won't tell you the location of Uncle David's village. It doesn't exist anymore, but I can't guarantee that its former site is safe or that the evil which once dwelt there is now gone. I will describe it to you, however. The village was called Moseville, an odd name with slightly sinister overtones. This was the title the attraction came with when David bought it, and he was adamant that the name wouldn't change. He was a stickler for tradition after all. Moseville was built to a scale of 1 to 72 and contained most of the features one would expect to find in a traditional English village, circa the late 19th or early 20th centuries. The main street consisted of a steepled church, Anglican of course, a neat town hall with a copper-domed roof, and a schoolhouse with big glass windows. The street also contained several tidy shop fronts, a butcher's, a grocery, a village pub, a bank and a post office, the type of small businesses which are slowly disappearing in the real world. Off the main street were the homes and houses, a mix of quaint cottages and Georgian townhouses. The detail was astonishing, right down to the tiny flower beds in the gardens surrounded by white picket fences. The manor house was located on the edge of the village close to the purposefully built stream which cut through the mock countryside. The house was 4 stories tall with stained glass windows and turrets. The grounds around it were meticulously designed and maintained, with a neat, tree-lined avenue leading out to its front gates. Further along the river stood a functioning windmill, more in the Dutch rather than the English design, but still in keeping with the ambience of the attraction. The final feature of note was the railway station to the south of the village, a long platform and red brick station house with an old steam locomotive that permanently sat on the rails, its adjoined carriages divided into first, second, and third class. And then there were the figurines, the tiny villagers who populated Moseville. Each was unique and had their own names based on their roles and jobs. Lady of the manor, the butcher, the vicar, the grocer's wife, the train conductor. All appeared to be happy people going about their daily business. Everything was well ordered and peaceful in Moseville, as it represented an oasis of tranquility in an otherwise chaotic world. Or at least, that's what we used to believe. As you can probably tell, I used to spend a lot of time in Moseville. My parents brought me and sister down there regularly when we were young and before Mom and Dad got divorced, and I recall how magical a place it was to visit as a child. My uncle was always happy to see us and to share his village with us, telling my sister and I the stories behind every building, feature and figurine. He was strict, however, warning us never to mess around with his beloved village. I remember one time when we accidentally damaged the church roof whilst playing, and David was furious with us. His reaction was scary, and I guess we didn't understand why he was so obsessed with his village. Sadly, David was a man with a lot of problems. But life moved on. My sister and I grew up and we stopped visiting Mosville and my uncle. I feel bad about it now, but I was a stroppy, hormonal teenager, and the last place I wanted to hang out was a boring old model village. Sadly, Uncle David's mental state only deteriorated in the years that followed. He took early retirement from his job and became even more obsessed with building and maintaining Mosville. For a while, he ran it as a family attraction, charging a small entrance fee for families to visit on weekends and bank holidays. But eventually he grew tired of these visitors and their disruptive ways, choosing to close Mosville to the public and make it his own private haven. In the years which followed, David became a total recluse, cutting ties with most of his family and the few friends he had. My mother would still visit occasionally, mainly to check that her brother was still alive, but she usually received a frosty reception. I don't know what happened to David which made him cut himself off from the outside world and become completely engrossed in his almost childlike hobby. Perhaps he suffered a personal tragedy or a heartbreak that we didn't know about, or maybe he just couldn't cope with the stresses and pressures of the world. In any case, I'm afraid his life was destined to end tragically. So let me tell you about the summer of 2001. My mother hadn't seen her brother in about 2 weeks. She phoned regularly enough, but my uncle rarely answered or called back. She went down to his cottage one day and couldn't get an answer when she rang the bell, or even when she knocked on the door repeatedly and loudly. Concerned, she used her spare key to enter David's home, but discovered he wasn't at home. Alarm bells started ringing at this point, as David rarely, if ever, went out. But Mum didn't panic just yet. She did start to really worry when she drove to the Mosville site and found David's workshop empty and no sign of him in the village. Not only that, but the site was a mess, with miniature buildings smashed in and figurines broken and scattered all over the concrete and grass. Mum knew how much Mosville meant to her brother, and she could only imagine the impact this act of wanton destruction would have on his mental state. At this point, she did panic and phoned the police, but they weren't able to file a missing persons report until 72 hours later. This deadline came and went and the report was processed, but no information was forthcoming. Mum phoned the police daily until they stopped returning her calls, and then she started her own search, getting stories published in the local press, posting missing signs all over the countryside, and starting a website requesting information, as this was before social media was a major thing. She worked so hard for so long but never got any solid leads. It was heartbreaking for us to see as the fruitless search consumed my mother. She always felt responsible for her brother's disappearance, feeling that she should have looked after him better. We told her constantly that she wasn't to blame, that he was a grown man who'd made his own decisions, but it was no good. Our mother kept the faith for years, still believing that David would turn up one day. I didn't share her belief, however. My uncle was always disturbed, and I feared he had gone to some quiet spot to end his life. Perhaps his body had been swept out to sea, and that's why he was never found. I think the whole family shared my theory, but we never spoke about it, and we never told Mum what we thought. It would have broken her heart. In any case, the search went from cold to freezing, and after 7 long years, my uncle was declared legally dead. This sad milestone broke my mother. She went on with her life, being there for her family, children, and grandchildren. But a big part of her died along with her brother, and she never really recovered from the tragedy. I think it surprised us all when we discovered that David had written a will, and he'd left all his possessions and assets to my sister and I, including his beloved model village. My sister had just had a newborn and so had no time to deal with this mess, and I couldn't ask our mother for help as it was still too raw for her. So I took on the task of dealing with my late uncle's estate. The plan was to sell up and split the money. There really wasn't any other practical option. David's cottage was in a bit of a state after all those years, but I knew some renovation work would fix it up nicely, and with the housing market the way it was, we could sell for a good price. Mosville was a different kettle of fish, however. There was little to no prospect of selling it as a going concern. The market for model villages in the modern world is almost non-existent for the reasons previously explained, and besides, the site was a mess. My best bet was to sell the land off for development, but first I needed to get the site appraised and valued, with due consideration given to planning permission and other issues. I made my initial visit to get the lay of the land. I'll admit to feeling trepidation on the drive down to the Mosville site, as all the old memories came flooding back. We'd had good times there during our childhood, but I kept recalling how Uncle David had raged with us when we accidentally damaged the church roof, and the terrible sadness my mom carried with her after his disappearance. I should have listened to my instincts, but of course I didn't. Instead, I told myself that my emotions had gotten the better of me and I needed to pull myself together. I had a job to do, however unpleasant it may be, and so I got to work with clearing the site. This is where my story takes a bizarre and dark twist. What I intend to do now is to transcribe the contents of my late uncle's diary, which I discovered during my clearance work. Most of its content is irrelevant, sadly giving little insight into David's state of mind. That was until I got to the final few days before his disappearance. The diary entries answered some of my questions but raised many more. This will become self-evident as my story progresses. You may also be wondering how the diary went undiscovered all those long years, while the police and my mother were on the case. Well, that's a question which is hard to answer, and so all I can say is please read on. So, let us begin with my Uncle David's entry for the 9th July 2001. Today the weather was quite good. It started off cloudy, but the sun came out in the afternoon. This makes a pleasant change after all the rain over the previous few days. Thank goodness, as I have much work to do. I spent the morning in my workshop, finishing off my new villagers whilst touching up the paint on some of my existing people. The police constable's uniform needed to be retouched, and I'm excited about introducing the new undertaker to Mosville. As always, I need to work with painstaking accuracy on my little people to get them just right. Attention to detail is everything in this line of work. In the afternoon, I took advantage of the sunshine to do some work in the village, polishing the dome of the town hall and replacing 3 of the trees in the manor house grounds. Much to my annoyance, I saw that the stray tomcat had invaded my village once again. I didn't see the little bastard, but found evidence of its intrusion with scratch marks on the church walls and several villagers out of place, scattered down the street with blatant disrespect. This will have to stop. I phoned the council to complain, asking that animal control captures the stray, but I doubt they'll do anything about it. I may need to take action myself. My sister called this evening. I didn't answer, but she left a message on the machine. This only added to my annoyance. I know she means well, but I wish she'd just leave me alone to get on with my work. Well, tomorrow is another day. 10th July 2001, I am beyond furious. It has taken me all day to regain some level of composure, so I can write down my experience and attempt to work through my anger. The day started like any other. I got up and traveled to Mosville to start work. What I discovered was an atrocity. Someone, or probably multiple persons, had broken in during the night and proceeded to wreak devastation in an act of pure barbarism. The bulk of the damage was confined to the main street. Several of the villagers were broken beyond repair: the grocer, the milkman, and the postmistress, all smashed to pieces. I don't know how anyone could be so cruel. There was some superficial damage to several buildings, but the vandals had taken out their anger on the church, breaking the steeple in half, crushing the roof, and stomping the building into the ground. I will need to rebuild the whole church from scratch. I was so angry that tears were rolling down my cheeks and I had to control my breathing before considering my next move. Once I calmed down somewhat, I phoned the police to report this act of wanton destruction. Sadly, this only added to my anger. They said they would process my report and send a constable out in due course, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. No doubt the vandalism was carried out by local teenage hoodlums. Children today are little better than animals, semi-feral and without discipline from their parents or teachers. The police will do nothing to stop them, and so these hooligans run amok, destroying property and ruining people's lives. This country really has gone to the dogs. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning up the mess. But there was another sickening twist to this foul tale. I almost missed it at first, hidden away as it was at the rear of the wrecked church. When I saw it, my heart froze for a second, and I believe I suffered a moment of genuine terror. The figurine was built to the same scale as my villagers, 1:72, meaning it was only an inch tall. I knew straight away that it wasn't one of mine. After recovering from my initial shock, I got down on my hands and knees to examine the miniature in closer detail. What I saw was a Grim Reaper, a sinister figure dressed in a dark robe down to his feet, and with a hood covering his head. The figure had no face but did carry a scythe almost as tall as he was, its blade made from an actual tiny razor. I found the figurine repulsive and would never have such an ugly miniature in my village. But this raised the disturbing question of who had left the figure, and why. I began to doubt my initial theory in that moment, thinking this was too sophisticated a trick for teenage hoodlums. Perhaps this is the act of a rival model villager, jealous of my creation. I took the Grim Reaper figurine back to my workshop to examine it more closely. I examined it under my magnifying glass, impressed by the precision its maker had used. This was clearly the work of a professional. There was something very disconcerting about the miniature, though, a creepy feeling that I couldn't quite explain. But things only got weirder. When I picked up the figurine, I found it was ice cold, like it was just out of the freezer. But as I held it in my hand, the figurine suddenly and inexplicably heated up. And in a moment it became so hot that it burned my hand, forcing me to drop it on the floor. I'll admit to swearing in rage as I looked down at the tiny Grim Reaper lying on the wood floor of my workshop. I couldn't understand what had just happened. Was this some sort of new technology? I'll gladly admit to being a Luddite, so I suppose it's possible. I should have kept the figure as evidence, but in my anger I acted in haste, using pliers to pick up the red-hot miniature and drop it into the furnace, watching with a grim satisfaction as it burnt to ashes. It's bedtime now, but I'm still angry and confused, so I doubt I'll get much sleep tonight. In any case, I will return to Mosville first thing in the morning. I pray this ugly incident is a one-off and I can put it behind me. 11th July 2001. The intruders returned during the night. It was naive for me to think they wouldn't. I'm angry but also deeply unsettled. Let me try to explain what happened. I arrived at Mosville shortly after dawn and went to work on the church reconstruction. At first it didn't seem like there was any additional damage, but then I noticed several of the villagers were missing. The pub landlord, the schoolmistress, the fireman, the nurse, and the mayor were all gone. I searched frantically for my little people, hoping against hope that I'd simply misplaced them. I couldn't find their bodies, but I did find the heads. Yes, I can hardly believe that I'm writing this, but that's what I found: 5 tiny severed heads, all carefully impaled on the railings in front of the town hall, forming a sick and macabre display. I could hardly believe my eyes. I was horrified, disgusted, and also amazed. The amount of effort it must have taken to remove the heads from the 1-inch models and mount them to railings only millimeters thick. It almost defied belief. I struggled to breathe as I surveyed the scene, but then I saw it. The Grim Reaper miniature, that hateful figure, was just standing there in the middle of the main street. It was as if it were mocking me. It couldn't possibly be the same model from the previous day. I'd watched it burn, for God's sake. I stared at the Reaper for a moment before realizing that whoever was doing this must have made several copies of the figurine to mess with my head. I felt paranoid at that moment, scanning the horizon as I imagined my tormentor was watching me from afar. I soon reassured myself, however. I felt sure the vandal was too much of a coward to show his face during daylight. He would surely return under the cover of darkness, but next time I'd be waiting for him. In a fit of rage, I stomped the Grim Reaper under my boot, crushing it into little pieces. Enough is enough. Tonight I will stand guard right here and catch the bastard in the act. He's going to regret he ever messed with me. 12th July 2001, I am in hell. Is this real? I don't understand and I'm so scared. I fell asleep at some point during the night, lying on the grass beside my precious village. It wasn't my intention to do so, but I was so tired. When I awoke, I instantly realized something wasn't right. It seems like a nightmare, but somehow it's real. The grass I'd slept upon was now as tall as I was. I stared at the blades in astonishment, and then at the mud beneath my feet. In confusion, I staggered forwards, pushing my way through the tall grass and hoping in vain that there was some kind of logical explanation. I saw a dandelion twice my size and almost had a heart attack, but this was only the start of it. As I trudged through the mud, I saw the dirt in front of me move as something huge emerged from beneath the ground. I stepped back, recoiling in horror as I watched a massive, slimy snake-like beast burrow its way up to the surface and slither out from the hole it had created. It took me a moment to realize what I was seeing, as its pink, segmented form wiggled out into the open. It was an earthworm, but grown to an immense size, an impossible size, easily as long as I was high, and with a body as thick as my thigh. I stood there paralyzed in fear as I watched the beast blindly slithering towards me. But a moment later, a huge shadow appeared above my head, a massive form which dwarfed me and the worm. There was an almighty squawk, a high-pitched din that almost deafened me. A second later, and the huge, winged beast dived down, reaching out with its mighty talons. I watched on in terror as the creature rapidly impaled the earthworm with its sharp talons before it secured it within a mighty beak. The winged beast squawked again as it flapped its vast wings and ascended back into the blue skies. I looked up as my unlikely savior flew away and was once again astonished to recognize the black, brown and white feathers of the monster bird, which I realized was nothing more than a common garden sparrow. I broke in that moment, still not understanding but knowing I was in grave danger. I sprinted for so long, cutting my way through the tall blades of grass and the giant wildflowers. Eventually I reached the edge of the grassland and found myself walking on hard concrete. I stopped and looked ahead, and then I saw it, Mosville, my miniature village. Except it wasn't miniature anymore. The scale was 1-to-1. The town hall towered above me and the wrecked church stood in front of me, and the villagers were equal to my own height. My tired brain struggled to comprehend the terrifying implications, and the answer was as obvious as it was impossible. Mosville hadn't magically grown to full size overnight, but instead I'd been shrunk. Inexplicably, I was now a mere inch tall, potential prey to insects and small birds, and with nothing but the clothes on my back and the diary I carried with me, which has also been shrunken to a proportionally small size. What's more, I was trapped in my own creation, a resident of my miniature village, and entirely cut off from the real world. I tried to control my panic as I slowly walked along the main street that I'd so carefully built and maintained over all these years. I was certainly frightened by this inexplicable development, but also exhilarated at seeing my beloved Mosville in a way I had never thought possible in my wildest dreams. But my boyish fascination didn't last as soon I had a new threat to deal with. I heard a familiar sound, a foul hissing amplified 100-fold. When I looked up, I saw the beast, a leviathan to me in my reduced form. It was the black tomcat, the stray which had caused me trouble over the last few weeks. I'd been able to see the feline off easily enough when I was a 6-foot-tall man, but now the small cat was as big as a T-Rex in comparison to my puny size. It stood at the far end of the village, its hungry green eyes glaring at me like I was nothing more than a kitty treat. I gasped in horror as I saw the cat stand up tall, its ears pinned back and eyes widening before it charged. The monster stomped along the concrete main street, the ground shaking under its huge size and weight. I ran for my life, desperately seeking sanctuary as the predator rapidly closed the gap. I made it to the town hall just in the nick of time, sprinting in through the doorway and diving into cover. The cat reached the door a second later, but thankfully it was far too big to get inside. It glared into the entryway with its predatory eyes, opening its maw to reveal huge and sharp fangs, and then it shoved its paw through the tiny doorway, reaching out with its deadly claws. I screamed, retreating back to the far wall and as far away as possible from the clawing attack. Fortunately, I was just out of reach of the predator, and so remained relatively safe inside of the structure. The cat continued its attempt to break in, but thankfully without success. I hoped it would give up and seek alternative prey, but instead the beast lay down on the main street, glaring at the town hall, as it patiently waited for me to come out. It's as if the cat has a personal vendetta against me and won't give up until I'm in its belly. I remain trapped inside the town hall as I write this, without food, water, or any prospect of rescue. I'm alone and scared, and I don't know how I'll get out of this in one piece. 12th July 2001. Evening. The cat left shortly after dusk. Actually, it didn't so much leave as it fled. I heard a high-pitched meow before the beast sped off at top speed, shaking the ground beneath its paws. I was relieved but also concerned. What in hell had scared the feline away? Was it another cat or dog? I feared I might be in even greater danger than before. But then again, perhaps the cat had been frightened off by a human being. Had my sister come looking for me? If so, maybe she could save me from this hellish predicament. I cowered in the town hall for several more hours before I felt brave enough to poke my head out of the door. To my relief, I saw it was all clear. The cat was nowhere in sight, but nor was anyone else. Feeling a bit bolder, I opted to explore the village under the dim light of the moon and the stars. This was not a wise decision. As I cautiously walked down the main street, past the model shops and lamp posts, I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. My throat was dry as I hadn't had anything to drink in the best part of 24 hours, and so I proceeded to the stream, cupping water in my hands and slurping it up greedily. For a moment I felt better, but then I raised my head and I saw it. The Grim Reaper figurine, standing just behind the gate to the manor house, glaring down upon me from the hillside. This was its third appearance, except now it was no longer a tiny model I could crush underneath my foot. The Reaper was now as tall as I was. I felt sure that this thing, whatever it was, surely it was responsible for my grim predicament, using some form of dark magic to reduce me to this tiny stature. I can't explain why, but in that moment a cold terror pulsated through me as I believed I was in mortal danger. Turning on my heels, I fled for my life, sprinting back to the town hall and sealing myself inside. I'm still here, cold, afraid, and hungry. I won't dare to leave my sanctuary again before dawn. I can only hope and pray that my prospects improve. 12/07/2001. Don't know what time, my God. Hell has come to my door. My own creations have turned against me. I write frantically as I don't have much time. I slept for a short spell, waking some time in the early hours. When I went to the window, my heart froze as I witnessed my worst nightmare come to life. All my villagers were standing there out on the main street, the artisans, the school children in all the professions, even the 5 previously taken minus their heads. They all stood there with menacing intent, forming a mob and facing the town hall. Those who still had their heads looked different than before. The smiles once on their faces now turned into mouths emitting silent screams, and their once friendly eyes now narrowed in anger. At their head was my nemesis, the dreaded Grim Reaper, his scythe in hand as he pointed the sinister weapon in my direction. And then it started. The Reaper gave the order, lowering his scythe and pointing it in my direction. This was the signal. To my shock and horror, the villagers all suddenly came to life, slowly marching forward in an awkward, almost mechanical fashion. I had no doubt that they meant to do me harm. I cower inside as I scribble this note, which will surely be my final words. They are banging on the doors and windows, trying to break in. There is no escape. I hope against hope that someone will find this journal and get word to my family, to my sister, nephew, and niece. I'm so sorry that I pushed you away. I love you all. This was my uncle's last entry, and I don't mind telling you that his final words moved me to tears. You're probably wondering how I discovered my late uncle's diary. Well, in many ways it was by pure chance whilst I was clearing out the site. The journal was still in its reduced size, a micro-miniature book, less than 1/4 of an inch in dimension. I could well have ended up throwing it out, along with all the other tiny models. But as I held it in the palm of my hand, I had a feeling which made me think of my uncle. I had to acquire specialist equipment to view the tiny book and use a powerful microscope to read my uncle's words. His terrible end defied belief, and yet I knew in my heart it was the truth. I never told my mother about my discovery, fearing what it would do to her. She went to her grave without ever knowing the truth. There was no body to bury, and I can only assume his tiny corpse was taken away by his killers, or consumed by local wildlife. I don't like to dwell on it, however, as it sickens me to imagine my uncle's final moments. As for Mosville, I had it completely demolished and sold the land. I've never returned to the location in all the years since. I can't help but feel that this bizarre tragedy would not have happened if David had kept in touch with his family. In the end, you could say that his obsession killed him. I don't know what you'll make of this story. I still don't fully understand it myself. All I know is that there are dark powers beyond our comprehension, and my Uncle David sadly fell foul of them. So, my final advice is to take care, because you can never know where an unhealthy obsession will lead you. I chose to descend. It was finally time. Ever since the cave was discovered in the mountain next to my hometown, I had always wanted to explore it. It was my right after all. I was the one who found it in the woods as a child. But everyone always told me I was too young to try. So I did the obvious thing and waited it out. I waited 12 years, watching the cave become a point of attraction for scientists and explorers, dreaming about being one of them someday. Literally. Barely any nights passed without me descending into those depths in my dreams, camping in the darkness and discovering new tunnels, and sometimes even stumbling upon unknown cave monsters and trying to run away from them, failing, and yelling out in agonizing futility as I got ripped to shreds. That did not deter me, however. On the contrary, every single dream I had inflated my thirst for it. I swear I could actually hear it calling out to me, a call to descend, begging me to see it in all its glory and mystery. And now, after my 12th year of waiting, I stood in front of the cave mouth. I had prepared everything I could, my skills polished to their utmost extent through exploring smaller, safer, more well-explored caves, and my equipment having been checked and tested tenfold. The cave was one of the more mysterious ones in the world, its true depth yet to be known, despite the vast number of explorers having tried. It was almost as if it had been saving its biggest mysteries for me, as if it knew it belonged to me. I could still hear its call, now louder than ever, emanating from the abyss that was the cave mouth, and although I did have my own internal thoughts reminding me of the dangers, I chose to descend. This being my first time exploring a cave of this scale, I was accompanied by a relatively, and disappointingly, large team of 3 fellow rookie cavers led by 2 veterans. We walked into the entrance to the first of many shafts we would have to climb down. The leaders had tied a rope to a tree a short distance from the mouth and lowered it into its shaft. One of them went down, and the remaining one helped lower us down one by one. It took me 5 minutes to scale it down. They then followed us, and we set forth into a tunnel, which led us to a narrow gap in the wall we were told we had to crawl through on all 4s. The crawl was 15 meters long, but we felt surprisingly safe thanks to our chaperones. When I crawled out the other end of the passage into a 6x6 room and turned back, I realized that the light of day that followed us had now completely disappeared, and our torches were the only thing letting us see. Though that was a matter of course. The surface was out of reach now of our hands and our eyes, and if we were to turn our lights off, our eyes would never adjust to the dark. Another reminder that I was right to bring backup lights and a whole lot of glow sticks with me. We turned back and went down a path, right underneath the one we had come through, one we would have totally missed if not for our guides. I braced myself for the unknown. For a few hours or so, our guides led us through some more shafts and tunnels, both narrow and wide, of the maze, describing the hallmarks we went through, and telling of their own experiences and discoveries in it. I almost felt cheated hearing them speak of how they had violated the sacred wonderland I was supposed to explore. But I knew better than to tell them about it. They also explained how caving is actually not as scary as most would believe, and you're only really in trouble if you get injured, or lack supplies, equipment, or company. That made sense, considering how easy it had seemed, but it too carried with it a feeling of dissatisfaction, a feeling that I had been cheating. We had to descend for 5 hours before we reached the first supply camp, a large limestone chamber 1,500 feet underground and 22 meters wide. We rested there, cooked and ate our canned food, and slept. I wondered if I would still have dreams of the cave, since I was now inside it. I was not disappointed. In my dream, I was in that same cave, but had no one with me and had to descend it on my own. I crawled through a passage that got narrower the further I got, until the walls felt like the coils of a boa constrictor, crushing the life out of me. I was woken up just then, and we headed for the next camp. The trip was much the same, except there were more narrow passages that we had to crawl through on our torsos. We reached the second camp by descending a 60-foot column, into a much bigger chamber more than 3,000 feet underground. Our guides told us this one split into various paths and chambers to scout, and we would be choosing one of those to explore the next day. Around this time we had heard the sound of water flowing that was much louder than what we had been hearing up till now. The leader told us that it was probably some rainwater that ended up flowing into the cave. Seeing the worried looks on our faces, he added that it was nothing to worry about. The water would most likely take one of the passages to flow into, and it would have to fill up almost the entire cave before reaching us. So even if something were to happen, we would have plenty of time to escape. We did the same as the first camp. We rested, ate, and slept, and I was in the middle of yet another cave dream when I was woken up by the thunderous sound of crashing water. Upon asking, the leader regrettably told us that the worst-case scenario had happened. The water was rising way faster than expected, and we needed to leave. They made preparations to climb the shaft while we gathered only the most important items so as to not slow us down. I felt heartbroken. I do not want to leave. This is what my whole life has led up to. Such thoughts clouded my mind as I tried to figure out what to take and what to leave behind. We still had thousands of feet to climb, so obviously I needed the food. The lights were definitely important too, so was my climbing gear. As I was figuring things out, the guide told me the others had started ascending the shaft again, so I threw my backpack on, catching a glimpse of concern on his face, and tied the harness around myself. I started to climb, but upon reaching the shaft, saw how much the water had increased, and was crashing down the same column I would have to climb. We could not climb through that water pressure, and I signaled as such to the guide. We regrettably lowered ourselves back down and hurried as we tried to find some place we could take shelter from the water. We chose one of the passages that sloped upward and crawled its narrow tunnel up until it sloped downward again. We came into a small room, this one more like 5 by 5 feet. We sat down and caught our breath and tried to analyze the situation. The two of us were the only ones left behind. We hoped that the rest of the team managed to make it to safety, but that did not ease our feeling of being trapped. The guide told me that we did not have to worry. We could try to follow this passage and reach the third camp. Maybe it had survived too. Listening to that made me feel relieved, and upon realizing that, I wondered, was I relieved that we would get out of the cave, or was I relieved that we could continue to descend? Did I take so much time packing up not out of confusion, but hoping for this exact thing to happen? The more I thought about it, the more it disturbed me. This was the first time I felt fear of my own greed, but it would not be the last. Regardless, I chose to continue my descent. It took us another few hours to get to the next camp, and we reached there after squeezing through a tiny claustrophobic tunnel 9 inches wide that stretched out for 30 meters. It was a grueling process, all the more so with just the two of us, but we pushed through. Upon making it to the camp, we felt overwhelmingly relieved and helped ourselves to the supplies available. After some much-needed rest and relaxation, the guide pulled out his map and started to review the next plan. He told me that there was actually a passage that led directly upwards, and that is what we would be using to get back to the surface. I was not paying much attention, however. My mind was overcome by the dread again, dread of the demon I had come to know as my greed. I saw that right below the passage the guide said would lead us upwards, there was another passage going downwards. As soon as I saw that, my mind let go of everything else. Every other sound, feeling, everything in my visual view was pushed out of my observation. All I could think was, I want to go there. The guide had to shake me to bring me back to my senses. He was concerned for me and told me to sleep for now. We would start our ascent the next day. The both of us laid down to sleep together on the wet rocks. I was awoken a few hours into my sleep. I lay on my side, seeing the cave we were supposed to take visible in the faint light right in front of me. its entrance slightly illuminated, as if showing us the hope inside its mouth and up its liberating climb. Below that, however, was something different. Below that was a Stygian abyss that not only gazed into me as I into it, but also called out to me. The call started out as a seducing whisper, slowly growing into a pleading moan and eventually going even further into a chilling cry that beseeched, commanded, threatened me to enter it. It was deafening. I could not move. I could not do anything. I understood this was just another nightmare, though, that did not make it any easier. The call seemed more than an audiation of my own greed. It was really there. An infernal siren of the depths, making itself known to no one but me. It was so much more terrifying than being chased by cave monsters or crushed by sentient rocks. I was paralyzed, and I felt so frightened and helpless. I was woken up by the guide around that part. He seemed concerned for me, but I told him I was okay. He told me it was finally time to go, and we had to gather our equipment and supplies. I stocked up on food and water. I was free to take my time this time. He told me that there was a column that we had to scale up, and this time he would go first to see if it was safe, and I would have to wait. I waited for a while, trying my best to avoid so much as looking at the passage below. However, I could not ignore the voices calling out to me. It felt agonizing to resist it. It was also infuriating. I thought I could make it end so much sooner if I just confronted the call and screamed at those demons to stop bothering me once and for all. And so I turned around and snapped my gaze to the entrance with determination to assert dominance over the voices. Unlike anything I could have expected, though, the voices stopped before I could even say anything. They were now replaced by utter silence, broken only by the dripping cave water and the distant sounds of the guide trying to climb high above. I felt tricked. This was what I wanted. The voices had ceased. The entrance to the passage that up till now felt like an impossible, maddening void was just another cave entrance, its mouth illuminated by my light. I now felt none of the pressures I felt forcing me to descend. That, however, was not comforting in the least. The pressure had been replaced with angst. I was free to go up the passage, reunite with the team, and come back sometime later to explore the same passage again, and nothing would be different. I now had my free will back. I could choose, and that was the reason behind the angst. The fact that I now had nothing pushing me to descend. It was just my own desire, my demon of greed. I wanted to go down there, despite it being common sense that me and the guide needed each other to get to the surface. Despite the fact that caving alone meant almost certain death, I wanted to leave him behind. I remembered how unsatisfied I felt, traveling with my companions. It all came back to me. How much I felt the cave belonged to me. How I felt it my right to explore its still virgin passages. And that brought me to terms with my desire. Thus I stepped down into the lower entrance. I chose to descend. It started off with a rocky path that sloped downwards, and I rushed down it. I could hear the guide calling out to me in the distance, and I had to get away from him, or he would come to take me back. I hoped he would not follow me, and could manage to somehow reach the surface without me. I had no intention of going with him. I had memorized a bit of the map, and knew that this passage split into several down the line. I just had to get there fast. I hurried as much as I could, ducking down under the stalactites, and reached the fork in the cave. I chose one, at random, and hurried down it. And just like that, I was out of the guide's reach. I slowed down and took my time, basically strolling ahead and checking out the path in front of me with my light. There was much less of a chance the guide would catch up to me now, and he was not stupid enough to risk going into the wrong path on his own. At least, I hoped he was not. If he decided to come after me out of a sense of responsibility, well, I wished him luck, but I would not want to go back to him. I still hoped he would find safety, but He did not concern me anymore. I was now free to enjoy my time here. I had a fair amount of equipment and supplies. I was able to find my own way through the tunnels and shafts through grit alone. Yes, I was blaspheming by going alone into unknown territory, but I just did not think about it. I simply chose to descend. A few hours in, I felt hungry and took a lunch break. I had a lot of food bars and unwrapped one of them to savor in the light of my glow stick. I took a moment to take in the environment. I was sitting in a slightly sloping tunnel about 2 meters wide, a tunnel that sounded wet. The only sound I could hear was the dripping of water echoing through the moist caverns. I felt the humidity too, on my skin and in my nose as I breathed in the musty, earthy smell. There was no turning back for me now. I would be spending the rest of my life in these wet paths. The dripping water was all I would ever hear. At least, that is what I thought, until another sound caught me off guard. I heard the sound of rock sliding over rock. I was confused. What could have made that sound? Was there someone else there? I thought the guide actually managed to catch up to me. But that was impossible. I was following my own path blindly. How could he have caught up to me just like that? The sound continued. I called out to him, and the sound stopped. My glow stick went out around the same time. What I heard next was something akin to shuffling. Not the shuffling of human feet, no, for there was no recognizable rhythm of bipedal motion. But it definitely was the sound of something moving. Maybe more like a large sack of gravel dragging along the ground. This was the first time I was made to feel external fear. All of a sudden, the water was not the only thing I could hear anymore. Besides that noise, I could also hear my own heart thumping in my chest, fueled by an apprehensive rush of adrenaline. I was breathing heavily, shivering in the total darkness. There was something else with me here, something alive, but not human, and that something was aware of my presence. I flashed back to my nightmares. I did not know what to do. The sound stopped, but that was replaced by a feeling that I was now being watched. I felt the presence of the thing that was making the sound. It was now right at the end of the tunnel, only a few feet away, and could very well see me. And then it just stayed that way. For a few minutes. For an hour. For several hours. All the while I was paralyzed with restless agitation. And then I heard the sound of it moving again. It was gone. Just like that. I jolted as if snapped out of a trance, panting heavily, and started crying. I had just come into contact with something I had no knowledge of, something I could not even see. For the first time, I had faced the fear of the unknown, and it was that fear that brought me back to my senses. What the hell was I doing? I did not want to explore anymore. I wanted to go home and forget this cave even existed. I turned on my light and looked back up to the way I came. And I remembered I was only blindly following along and had no idea how to get back. Besides, that was the way the creature had come anyway. I looked the other way, down the way I was heading. I heard the siren's call to descent again. I whimpered and tears welled up in my eyes once more. That was the only choice I had. There was no turning back. Hesitant, I once again obeyed those whispers. Once again, I chose to descend. I would not come across that kind of creature again as I traveled the caves for days, following the siren's whispers. I slept when I wanted to sleep, ate when I wanted to eat, and went when I wanted to go. But I could not stop descending. When one of my lights ran out, I switched to another one. All I could do was keep moving, and eventually the food inevitably ran out. When it did, I thought my time had finally come. I now had no choice but to starve to death. That is, until I came across an underground lake. And in it I found a creature. It was no alien monster, but a simple cave bug, and before I could think, I grabbed it and shoved it into my mouth. And thus, my demise was prolonged, and my diet shifted to the critters and lizards I found in the cave. Eventually, my water ran out too, and I started drinking from any source of water I found in the cave. I knew it was not safe or pleasant to consume, and neither were the critters. But I was not in control of my body now. It was moving on its own, and would rather die painfully of disease and exhaustion than stop or starve. I somehow managed to avoid any major injuries, and the voices compelled me to ignore any minor cuts and scrapes. My body kept delaying my fate with every smallest chance of survival, and I could only keep moving as I waited in agony for the release of death. I would keep moving for some more days, maybe weeks, or even months, until I wondered if I was closer to the Earth's core than to the surface. It was definitely getting warmer. After some time, as I squeezed through the nth tunnel, I dropped onto a muddy floor, which caught me off guard, as it had been a while since I had seen anything other than boulder slopes. I stood up and examined the area, which seemed like a warm and slightly misty cavern, around 10 meters in diameter, its floor muddied by water dripping from the stalactites. I walked around and tripped forward almost instantly as my foot caught onto something. I tried to see what it was that had tripped me and stumbled back again, as I realized it to be a human-sized skeleton. I got up again and approached it nervously, and picked it up to observe it. It was definitely the size of a human, but not human at all. The skull, for one, seemed more like that of a reptile, and the bones, although thicker and stronger than human bones, seemed hollow. It had 8 limbs, 4 of which seemed like arms, 2 like legs, and 2 that fit the function of both. Each limb ended in 4 finger-like appendages. The ribcage-esque part was a lot wider and denser, and expanded to cover almost the entire torso, and brought to mind a turtle shell. The best way to describe it would be a combination of an insect and a tortoise skeleton. This was clearly a creature unlike anything humans knew. I looked around. There were at least 4 more such fossils, mostly buried in the mud. Once again, I was reminded of my cave nightmares. I remembered the creature I had met in the dark back then, the one that for some reason chose to spare me. I had not been able to see it then, but I remember the sounds it made, which looking back could have been akin to what some giant, muscular, vermiform organism would be like. These things were clearly different. I trudged through the mud in a hurry, wanting not to spend a second more in that damned chamber. I just could not wrap my mind around the fact that I had come across not one, but 2 species that had been living unbeknownst to us so far below the surface. I did not want to think about it, but I could not just stop thinking either. How long had these things been around for? Were they simply animals, or were they intelligent like us? What would happen if I were to come across one of them? What would they do to me? Were there other such abominations here? Were my dreams more than just dreams? I shivered as I walked around. The thoughts were too excruciating for me. After walking for a while, I found the way out, which was a steep and muddy slope downwards. Without a moment's hesitation, I jumped in and slid down it. This time I landed on a rocky surface that was only slightly muddy. In front of me, however, was total darkness. I was confused. I checked my torch. It was on, but shining it in front of me revealed nothing beside a pitch-black darkness. I looked around and down and realized I was on a sort of escarpment, a cliff edge next to the wall. The edge went along the wall and sloped down, though that was all I could see. I did not know how deep it went or how vast this giant cavern in front of me was. My torchlight dispersed after only a few feet in front of me. It had nothing to reflect off, nothing to illuminate ahead. The cosmic terror enveloped me again. Up till now, when I stared into the darkness of the caves, I could feel it staring back into me, as if it was enjoying how much it intimated me. This was nothing like that. The abyssal void I faced now felt like it did not so much as notice my presence. It did not care how I felt. It did not care if I was even here. Yet it was right in front of me, seeming to expand its cold, uncaring tendrils of horrifying nothingness into and beyond me, stretching fathomlessly deep below, cosmically vast around, and endlessly unending within. No description would ever be enough to capture it. It was like meeting God and peering right into his sheer, true, innate and raw cosmic indifference, like dissolving yourself in the soup of total infinity itself. It was truly and utterly maddening. After shuddering in maddened despair for hours on end, I heard the siren again, and again I answered it by forcing my rubbery legs to follow the path along the cave wall. Walking down around the darkness, I could not help but try to encapsulate its vastness by my reason. It was an underground cavity, clearly, but the sheer size was far beyond anything thought possible. The entire cavern should have collapsed under the pressure of the rocks above it. I wondered if it was the cause of deliberate intervention. Even if it was, though, I could not so much as guess what any comprehensible purpose of it was in the first place. One possibility, that I hoped to God was not true, was that it was as a nest for some other sort of beast of incredible yet terrible proportions. After walking for hours on end, until the call to descent itself faded out, I found another exit on the side of the same path. I made no second thought choosing that foot-wide tunnel over the aggravating spiral that ran uninterrupted down for who knows how long. I half crawled, half slid my way down it, and ended up in another chamber. This one having nothing suspicious, but had the entrance to a shaft. Thinking it was still better than the void I had come from, I scaled it down and followed the passage it led to. It was on that path that my exhaustion caught up to me. I put my equipment down, turned my light off, and curled up to sleep while still holding it. For a while now the cave dreams had stopped haunting me, but they were replaced with something more torturous. Like many times before since I had been lost underground, I remembered the time before I had set foot in these damn places. I remembered the companions I came with and had abandoned for my own insolent greed. I regretted everything up to that point. I cursed myself for wasting my life chasing these rock mazes. This cave did not belong to me. I belonged to it. I should have lived my life like everyone else, and not some cave-worshipping fool. Even if I had come here, I should have stayed with my crew and followed my instructors. I prayed, more sincerely than I ever had in my life, for a chance to go back, to trade every choice I had made that brought me here for a simple chance to be back on the surface. I cried myself to sleep, wishing I would wake up at home. Having spent so long down here, I had gotten used to waking up in total darkness. That is why I slept with a torch in my hand. I would wake up, rub my eyes, and turn it on before getting ready to move on again, which is precisely why I was too confused and still considered myself to be dreaming. When I woke up and found I could just barely see the rock wall in front of me, I looked at my torch. It was off. I turned it on, examined the passage, and off again. It got dark, but my eyes adjusted after a while and I could see again. There was light here. I punched the wall to see if I was not dreaming. After my painful yet overjoyed confirmation, I grabbed my things and set forth, hoping to find the source of the literal light at the end of the tunnel. I was almost jogging. The hope had brought forth a hidden feeling of excitement I had forgotten long ago. The tunnel went on for some few dozen meters, and the air was now starting to get more humid. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest as I took the last turn and faced the exit that had a few rays of light shooting through its mouth. I stepped forth and cried out in awe at the sight in front of me. It was a city, an underground metropolis, or the ruins of one at least. I had come out into the bottom of a massive valley of some sort, one that seemed to almost stretch out and up forever, but one that did end, appearing like a crack in the ceiling, one lit up with daylight. It was actually really deep, however, around half a dozen kilometers by my estimate. That is how far below I had wandered. Still, the exit was right there. The walls of the trench had buildings, structures and bridges either carved or built into it, and they seemed to extend along the walls right up to the surface. In the near distance, on the bottom surface, there was a dense network of bridges leading to and from a condensed cluster of tall spires and prism-shaped buildings, with a pyramidal structure in the dead center of the cluster that towered above the others and resembled a Sumerian ziggurat. I could tell it was abandoned as the structures were all covered in vines and moss, surprising to find any at this depth, and there were no sounds to signal any active population. There were distant sounds of birds and other wildlife, though, which were again strange to hear at this depth. I looked around in marvel at a city the likes of which I had never been aware of. Then I remembered the discoveries I had made up till now, and the marvel changed into the same, now familiar fear of the unknown. Perhaps this city was not a human construction. Knowing that, I started retreating back into despair, now added on to the fact that I did not know where I should go. I had been following a single path and had not come across any possible alternatives. I definitely did not want to go back to that pit of blackness, but it could not have been safe walking around in this place on my own either. Next came the sensation from back when I encountered the creature in the dark, the feeling of being watched. There was definitely something, or things hidden somewhere in those ruins, and I did not want to step forth in there. I felt cornered and helpless again. I leaned against the wall of the entrance I had come out of and contemplated taking my own life to just get it over with, as I hopelessly looked around what I could see in the city. My eyes drifted back to the ziggurat in the middle and the cluster of buildings and bridges around it. I scanned the paths of the bridges and traced one that seemed to lead up to the surface. I traced it back down to the ground, and my eyes followed the path I would have to take to reach it. I still felt eyes on me. The danger still lingered. Slitting my throat still seemed the best way out, but maybe, just maybe, I could make it. Maybe if I held on to the faint glimmer of hope, I could go back to the life I so took for granted. I stood up again, keeping low and carefully sneaking around, in a way that I knew was really pointless, given how in plain sight I was, but had to be tried. I walked crouched down and moving along the right wall. It was something I felt I had to do, but it still did not make me feel any safer. Being so close to the wall and touching it made me realize it was not a valley at all, but an artificially constructed straight wall, strewn with writings and hieroglyphs, none of which I understood or even wanted to. That being said, I did see a lot of drawings and carvings of some particular giant amorphous beast. One I could at my best describe as having the features of a slug, an arachnid, and a reptile. The path was also now littered with geothermal vents, a few of which I had been coming across for a while back when traveling through the caverns. The difference being that these vents apparently had broken the paved ground and seeped through it, enveloping the path and lower parts of the city with a warm mist. It did make sense, considering how far below I was at that point. Before I knew it, I had been walking through the underneath of the heart of the city. Whatever watched me had not harmed me so far. It could even just have been my own exaggerated sense of danger. The buildings I wanted to reach were relatively close to me now. The path I would take to get to the surface was an incline starting from the floor and lay atop of a building that tapered underneath it to the ground. I wondered how this city functioned, what the point of that unique cluster was, and how many aeons this city dated back. Maybe even before us. There was the tiniest sense of curiosity telling me to explore this city, but it was far overwhelmed by my fear and caution. I wanted to get out of here as soon as possible. Although perhaps, if I managed to make it, I could bring home probably the greatest discovery in history. This added sense of possible fame rekindled the embers of hope in my heart. All the anxiety was now gone. The sounds of the wilderness far above me now sounded like a greeting. I was now a lot less afraid, and in much more of a hurry to head up that path and back home. Thus, I had forgotten about caution and was now sprinting in a straight line, wading through the increasingly hot mist. To the way home I could see ahead. I saw the ramp get closer as I ran, my eyes glowing with joy and gratitude, and planned to run right up it. Just as I reached the base, though, all of that stopped all at once as I heard it. That wretched siren, the one that had been with me up till now, the one that made me come down here in the first place. It was back, and it had now drowned out all other sounds around me. Waves of confusion, disbelief, discomfort all washed over me, all. Why? Why now? The way outside was right in front of me. I had decided I wanted no more of this descent. Besides, where else would I go? I stood fidgeting, and then looked around for the source of that sound, where it was calling me to now. Then I saw it. Another cave, right beside the ramp, on the side of the wedged building. It was enveloped in mist, and now called out to me hauntingly. I shook my head in unbelief. No, I do not want to go there. But the voice, it just will not stop. I turned on my light to see inside its entrance. It turned on, flickered a bit, and went back out. It had no more battery. I had no other torch left, and I had used up all of my glow sticks. If I went in there, I would be going in totally blind, and had no idea what I would encounter there. Just some more endless caves, or perhaps some other abominable beast. Perhaps a whole world totally different to what I had seen up till now. Perhaps something else entirely. It was hotter than the vents around me, hot enough to make me sweat buckets while standing outside it. I was dehydrated, and I had not eaten in days, as I had not been able to find even any bugs to eat. And despite the sounds of the wildlife above me, there was no such thing for me here either, and the voice sounded like it did not want me to go up even to secure food. The prospect of a way out had given me some hopeful energy, but now I was running on fumes. I felt sick. By all accounts, I would not return alive if I chose to go down there. I looked back up to the path leading to the surface. Hope, a way home, it was right there. Yet despair had the audacity to call out to me now, when it was right in front of my grasp, and tell me to descend to my death. Did it know my soul that well? I looked up. I looked down. I looked up. I looked back down. Two paths stood in front of me, and I made my choice. I chose to descend. The starvation of angels, soft beeping from my alarm woke me that morning. The same sound as always, a pulsing of noise that was like a heartbeat. Over the years, I'd grown used to the noise signifying another day at the station. I was positive about my lack of work, but I could just feel some new and horrific case would be looming over me soon. Turning my clock off to prevent it waking my slumbering wife, I pulled myself out of bed and got dressed. I had breakfast and read the news. Old cases printed on the cover. Almost in sync with my need to get up and head over to the station, a knock came at my door. Back to the grind, I hummed as I kicked my shoes on. On opening the door, I found my work partner, a spry woman in her late 30s with curly red hair pulled back into a ponytail. She wore a light brown coat and a sweet smile. "Morning, Harrison," she chirped before pushing a coffee into my hands. "Boys want you over at Saints Lane apartment block. Seems they've found a body." I took the coffee from her, same one she gave me every day, and sipped it. About time we got some more work. Smiling, I closed the front door and headed to her car. Sharon Whittingham, to give her full name, was a detective like me. I trained her and was expecting her to move to a new city once she was trained, since she had the skills to go far. But she, like most people who live here, stayed. Within half an hour we'd arrived. The complex we found ourselves at was the kind people tell of in ghost stories. Old, damp, and half empty. It was once a low-cost housing ideal from about 50 years ago.
but the only thing it kept after countless contractors had pulled out was the low cost. A few squad cars were already outside, their lights flicking on and off rhythmically. From what Sharon had told me, we knew the body was that of a young male, about 23 years old. We were trying to hunt for his family, but as yet didn't have many leads. I ran through the notes in my head as we ascended the 4 flights of stairs, up to room 307. Yellow and black tape was hung about the place, stopping the other dozen residents of the complex from getting in. The door had been broken in by our own forces in an attempt to see what the source of the foul smell in the complex was. Little had been disturbed in the apartment itself. A few things like pillows were on the floor, but nothing to suggest a struggle. Sharon headed into the bedroom of the apartment and nodded her head towards the body. Grimly, I followed her in. There, lying naked on the bed, was a young man with black hair, green eyes, and a few studs. His body was a mess. Most of his chest had been pulled open, and the lungs and heart partially removed, clawed out by long nails. Though his death looked horrific, the young man had a peaceful look on his face. "What a sorry sight," I commented, walking over to the body to take a closer look at the gaping wound in his chest. "That's what I said." Sharon nodded, looking around the bedroom. "This case looks like an odd one. I mean, just look at this room. It's immaculate, not a thing out of place. It doesn't look like there was a struggle to me." I nodded in agreement before looking at the man's side table to inspect it for clues. I pulled some gloves on and started to leaf through his possessions. "Has anyone reported hearing a disturbance here in the past few weeks?" "No. The kid hardly made any noise, it seemed. He moved in a few years ago. Didn't go out much or have many people over." "Do we have a name?" Yeah, I think so. He called himself Joshua Brown. He was working near here, at a restaurant as a waiter." "I see." I moved back from the small bedside cabinet, making note of a framed photo by the lamp. The image was of the boy, Joshua, in his late teens, with another boy with long white hair, snowy skin, and a pink jumper. They looked happy together. Just as I was about to stand, I noticed a few empty packets of contraceptives on the floor. I picked them up carefully and placed them into a clear plastic bag before showing them to Sharon. "Do you think he knew his killer?" Sharon eyed me for a moment. She always said I had an odd way with words. "Well, he could have done it with his killer before he met his maker, so to speak." She pondered for a moment before spotting the photograph. "If we look at it from that angle, it's totally plausible. We should try to see who he knew, who his friends and lovers were. Unless it was a one-night stand, of course." I nodded and wandered around the room some more. "Get someone to look into his mobile phone records, computer, and whatever other communication device he has. That'll be a good first lead. We should also be able to get some DNA from this place, if we need to identify." "You talk like such an old man sometimes." Sharon smiled. "If we get this to court, we should be able to prove who did it. We just need to find the one who did the deed." I stifled a chuckle. "You talk like a teenager sometimes, Sharon." I knew full well my comeback had no effect. "Let's hope we can get whoever did this. As if we ever let them get away." I smiled at her optimism and continued my search. As expected, a good number of DNA samples were recovered and sent off to the lab, while Sharon and I spoke to his neighbors to see if anyone knew Joshua. They all said the same thing. As far as they knew, he was a very quiet lad, though his appearance may have suggested otherwise. He was kind, didn't talk about himself or his family much. We were still finding it hard to get in contact with his parents, or the boy in the photo, whoever he was. The few photos around Joshua's flat were almost all of the albino teenager, and we guessed they'd probably been partners at some point. Working on that assumption, we'd started to construct a story that the two had probably split up or moved apart, but had met up again recently. and the albino had, after intercourse, killed Joshua. It was a little flimsy, but we had to start somewhere. It was long after 11 that night that I finally took a taxi home. In the heat of the moment, I'd lost myself in work, and I'd lost all track of time. Only when I saw it was so late did I at last leave. I arrived home and was met by my darling wife. Even now, 43 years after first meeting her at college, she hasn't lost her looks in my eyes. Even after she had her first stroke, I still loved her looks. They do say love is blind after all. "Good evening, love," I said with a soft voice. You could say that me and my wife, Annabelle, were the ideal model of what an old married couple should be, still as close as ever. Though I now had a full head of silver hair, I hadn't retired. After my wife's first stroke, she'd wanted our lives to stay the same. She stayed at home and rested while I went to work. I loved my work, and the money it brought in helped to pay the medical bills. "Evening," my wife replied after a short pause. "How was work today?" I embraced her and smiled, not giving her an answer other than a happy moan. Annabelle hugged me back, smiling. I hated telling her about my work, the death I saw, so I hid it from her. For the rest of the evening, we simply ate dinner and watched TV, before falling asleep at about 1 a.m. The next day started the same. My alarm started softly to raise me from slumber, and then I left to greet Sharon. She filled me in on some of the developments that had happened since we spoke last. The body had been moved from the apartment, and we were now free to do a deep search. Joshua's laptop had been found and was in the lab, being pulled apart for information. I needed confirmation that nothing had been missed, so I rode with Sharon to the apartment. The place was quiet as we went in, the smell of damp stronger than ever now. On entering the apartment, we found that little was out of place, thanks to the hands of our experienced team. I started to look about, first going through the kitchen and then the living room, followed by the bathroom, then the bedroom, looking in more detail than I had done before. I made a note that the kitchen was poorly stocked to feed 2 people, and that the only clothes belonged to Joshua. Sharon and I quickly came to the same conclusion, that he was living alone at the time of his death. My gaze turned back to the bed. Most of the covers had been taken away, but there was still some dried blood on the mattress, outlined by tape to show where the body once lay. I looked at Sharon, who was rummaging through the dresser to the right of the small window that gave light to the room. On top of the dresser, there were a number of small trinkets, including a photograph of the albino boy, a freestanding cross with a rosary hung about it, and a copy of the Bible. "See anything, Sharon?" I asked, slowly walking over to look over her shoulder. "Well, he was into his religion, but it looks normal enough." She pondered, tapping the side of her neck in thought. I nodded in agreement, coupling this with a small noise to signify I thought she was indeed correct. "I'd like to know who the albino boy is. He looks to be a bit of a theme here. Possible suspect? I can't be sure until we find him, but it's within reason." I picked up the photograph and removed it from its frame. For a moment I studied the image before noticing something as I held it to the light. Dark patches. Careful to not damage the deceased's possessions, I turned the image over to see writing on the back. It read like a love letter, short, sweet, and simple. "It was sunny that day. Like the sun, you light up my day, my angel," I quoted aloud. Sharon looked back at me in puzzlement for a moment, before realizing I was reading something. "Is there something on the back of the photograph?" With a nod, I handed over the image. "No name, sadly." Like me, Sharon studied the writing. At least we know now that the 2 of them were dating. A bit tacky, if you ask me. I chuckled. When you find love, you'll learn that there is no such thing as tacky. You know full well I have no intention of finding love, Sharon responded flatly. She'd explained to me before that she wasn't interested in any kind of relationship that wasn't work of friend-based. She enjoyed her solitude. We'll see, I smiled back before going to inspect the other images. Let's try and find the name of the albino boy. That's our first task. Sharon agreed before hunting about for more photos to see if any others had messages on the back. Sadly, we were out of luck. After collecting a few more of the young man's possessions, we headed back to the station to try fit the links together and to wait on the labs to give up more information. It was past 4 when I got a call from the station's pathologist, a towering blonde-haired man we all lovingly called R. He was from Russia and had one of those very tricky names with a great number of K's and V's in it. He told us he had news about the body and asked us to come over as soon as we could make it. I told Sharon, and we headed over to his lab on the other side of town. R was a workaholic like myself and often pulled all-nighters against his better judgment. We headed into the small clinic and were buzzed into the main lab by R's young receptionist. R greeted us at the entrance to his lab. His long blonde hair was pulled back into a ponytail that often sat on his shoulder. His eyes were a soft blue and he wore a long white lab coat. On his right wrist, he had a small gold bangle, which I'd never seen him remove. His skin was very white, and he often wore a somewhat blank expression, the kind you see on the face of someone who's lived with death for many years. I saw myself in R sometimes. Harrison, Sharon, glad you could make it over here so quickly. R smiled, holding out a hand. I took his hand and shook it. Well, you know what we're like, eager to get things done. Good to see you again. R had worked for us for about a year now. Before that he was a GP, a very good and caring one too, but after a tragedy struck his family he started to work here. Sharon also shook R's hand before heading towards his lab. R smiled in my direction to thank me for the pleasantries. I knew he wasn't a talker. I followed and looked over to a metal table that presented the body of the victim, covered with a thin white sheet. What I found was pretty interesting, really. A bit of a sick case, though, the doctor commented, before pulling the cover down to reveal the upper half of body, folding the cover just under the wound in his chest. What do you mean? Sharon asked, walking over to look, while I admired from afar. As I see it, his ribcage was pulled open, and then most of the ribs removed, followed by the consumption of the lungs and heart. There was a dumbfounded silence. You mean someone's eaten him? Sharon shouted, a little too loudly for R's liking, as he was very sensitive to sound. Yes, eaten, R responded, a little agitated to have had Sharon shout at him. There are both large claw and bite marks on the remaining tissue. He signaled to a mouth-sized bite mark, consisting of many needle-like holes that was uncovered at the bottom of the rib cage. I felt a little ill just thinking about the notion of one human eating another. Those aren't human, though. I mean, look at them, Sharon exclaimed, as shocked as I was. Well, these bites come in sets of 2, and they're the right proportion to be human. Say the one doing the eating had possession of some kind of adapted weapon. Humans are strange creatures, you know. R's eyes, peering over his glasses, remained on the body. I paused. He did have a point after all. Maybe this was a far more twisted story than I'd first imagined. For the rest of the meeting, R filled us in on what else he'd worked out about the body and gave us his full report. After reading through the case notes, Sharon and I both headed home. Annabelle met me at the door, and we chatted about our day, though I made sure to cut out as much of the gore as I could. I picked at my dinner and avoided mention of food for the most of the evening. Honestly, I was shaken by what R had told me, so much so that I could hardly respond to my wife. Around 10, I went to bed, although I couldn't sleep. With the case on my mind, it was hard to think of anything else. Ideas rattled around my head. I arrived at the station by 7, A little early for me, but I felt like walking. There's something about walking, to arrive before anyone else, that's strangely enjoyable. By lunchtime, Joshua's journal was released from the labs, with every page copied and recorded. Sharon went out again to ask around about the young man while I stayed put to read the journal. It was a few years old, but I thought it would still be in the right time span to possibly include information about the albino. I was right to assume it would. The journal was nothing special. It went from the teen's 15th birthday and stopped at his 16th. It started with the boy describing what he got for his birthday, a phone, the book he was writing in, and a few trinkets from one of his friends. He spoke highly of his friend, who I gather was known as Lyat. If Lyat was the name of the albino boy, then it should be easy enough to find him. After all, there can't be too many kids called Lyat in the US. For the next few hours or so, I focused on nothing but the journal, making sure to take notes on pretty much everything about the teen's life that he wrote about. To my disappointment, there wasn't much of interest apart from a few briefly mentioned cases of bullying, some underage sex between the young Joshua and Lyat, and a few small social events that he and Lyat had attended. Joshua seemed to be very close to Lyat. He seemed to love him deeply, although it was mentioned that the boys never told their parents. The journal told of how Lyat was badly bullied at school and suffered depression as well as some other health problems. He took a lot of medications, an amount I'd consider to be unsafe. As the journal went on, things remained the same. The two lads to date in secret, and they kept their heads down at school to avoid attention. Slowly, I closed the journal with care before noticing that Sharon had come in. "Hey, Harrison, how's tricks?" she inquired, coming over with some lunch. Gladly, I took it from her. Well, it looks like we have a name to match a face now. It seems from the journal that Joshua was dating a boy named Lyat, around the age of 16, and it looks like a long-term relationship to me. Sharon picked up the book and started to skim it, along with my notes. "Reckon we've got our suspect's name?" "Seems so." "Well then, let's put it into the computer." Triumphantly, Sharon collected the notes from the desk before heading over to the computer. Though my old legs had fallen asleep from the long time sitting, I raised myself and headed after her. By the time I arrived, Sharon had sat herself down at a computer and was punching in her login. Before long, our files were open and the hunt was on. As expected, it didn't take long at all, although what I saw filled me with disappointment. Lyat Penhart, a white-haired male from a small town in Texas, was found guilty today of murder-suicide. The youngster, age 17, shot dead his father, the town's resident priest, on Monday the 17th of February. The verdict of the court can now bring answers to those affected by the event. Sharon sighed deeply, reading aloud the article that was before her. "Looks like we went down the rabbit hole on this one, Chief." I nodded, although I remained transfixed by the article. It was simple, with little detail, but there was a mention of 3 older brothers, a mother in her 40s, and the cause of death for both Lyat and his father. His father was shot in the chest and later died at hospital, while Lyat shot himself in the head. Poor thing. "Yup, back to square one it seems," Sharon commented. "We'll find other leads, we can do this." I smiled, knowing this had probably knocked the wind out of Sharon's sails. She has this habit of sticking to one idea in a case, and only gives up on it if she is proven wrong. I know. For a moment, she just pretended to read the article before stopping herself, leaning close to the screen. "You reckon Joshua would have known Lyat's brothers?" "What do you mean?" "Well, Joshua's boss told me he was a bit of an introvert. He never really went out and hardly ever talked to anyone. Since the other residents in Joshua's complex never saw him with anyone, is it safe to assume that he knew the killer, since he wouldn't really invite a random stranger in? Say one of Lyatt's brothers came to town. Joshua offers them a place to stay, and then the rest is history. Sharon knew herself this could be a little bit far-fetched, but I knew she'd look into it. Find the family then. See if we can get more information, I suggested. Got it. On that, Sharon started to dig into our computers for more information about the family while I simply went to work organizing the files for this case, hoping to see a fresh trail. I arrived home at 7 again that night. I greeted my lovely wife and sat with her at the dining table. Though her mind was sometimes muddled and she wasn't always entirely there, I could see she was pretty excited today. Interested as to why this was, I slipped it into conversation over our beef stew. How was your day then, Annabelle? I smiled, happy in the knowledge that she seemed better today than she'd been in a long time. The doctors had warned of another stroke if she became stressed or was too active, so she often confined herself to the house, doing very little at all. It was as if she'd been prescribed loneliness. But some days she was happy to live like this. Oh, my day was lovely. She smiled, looking up from her meal. A very nice boy came over today. He was collecting for charity. Did you give them anything? I asked back, knowing my wife was a very generous person. Well, she said after a little pause, he was looking to collect clothes, so I gave him some of the shirts that are too small for you now, as well as some change. I tried to invite him in for cake and sandwiches. Her mind trailed off for a moment before she smiled. I invited him in for tea, but when he came in, he didn't eat anything, though he did say he was hungry. Odd boy. Often my wife would repeat her sentences, forgetting what she'd just said. That's nice. I've been meaning to get rid of thought shirts for a while now. I smiled. There was something about talking like this that always helped me get my mind off work. I allowed the conversation to continue until we'd finished dinner. Then we watched TV and went to bed, just like most nights. It was a simple lifestyle, but I wouldn't ask for any other. For the next few days, nothing happened of much note. All 3 Penhart brothers had alibis for the night of the murder, and so did the now single mother. Joshua's parents told us that their son hardly ever spoke to them, but they would come and collect his body soon. We found a few more leads, though they all ran cold sooner or later. The IT department was still working on the computer and the phone of the deceased. It was late. Few lights were on in the city, but I still burned the midnight oil, working through statement after statement about the young man. Every one of them said the same thing. Joshua never talked to anyone, never had anyone over, and pretty much never left his apartment, apart from when he went to work or went shopping. I was at a loss. Knock, knock, hummed a familiar voice, baritone and tinted with accent. I looked up and saw R in the doorway, holding a few files. Like me, he was burning the midnight oil, though it was a little odd to see him in my office. I welcomed him in. Evening, doctor. R came in, sitting across from me at my desk, before taking my notes to read over them. Shouldn't you be at home with your wife now? Though I'd love to. I'm at a loss here, R. I'm not the man I was 30 years ago. He smiled, I watching him read over my notes before taking a look at the file he'd brought with him. Didn't expect to see you here so late. I wanted to hand over these notes. I've found some bits and bobs. He paused. Where are you with the case? I knew full well that R would not be willing to tell me anything about his finds unless I told him mine. He liked to trade information. It was one of his many odd tricks. Well, we've closed the case on trying to find the albino kid. Turns out our top suspect has been dead for years. We can't find any new leads. This job looks like it was done professionally, R, and I'm starting to wonder if we can solve it. I knew full well I was putting it on thick, being a pessimist, but I wanted to go over the top. The albino kid? Sharon mentioned him over some drinks. She was so hyped up about finding the supposed killer so quickly. I didn't want to tell her. Tell her what? I asked in response. Don't you know? I thought you looked into the Penhart incident. No, I thought it was an open-shut case. Was it not? R smiled knowingly. He always reveled in knowing things that others didn't. Not totally. The trial was a shambles. Evidence was lost, statements pulled out, and reports rejected. Originally, it was going to be presented as a case of retaliation, an act of self-defense, with the remaining parent standing trial for domestic abuse, but it was not to be. Closing the files he was reading, I watched a rather smug smile creep across the tall doctor's face. Lyatt's body went missing. I paused, half annoyed that I hadn't been told, but then also confused. Went missing? It sounded foolish, but R didn't usually lie. Yep, I knew the pathologist who was going to make an assessment of Lyatt's body before laying him to rest, but the night before she was going to make the report, the body just vanished, gone without a trace. That's total fiction, I exclaimed. A body can't simply get up and walk away. R nodded, then opened the file he was going to deliver to me. Up to you whether you believe me or not. Me and some work friends called it the body snatcher. When opened the file, I saw some of the latest DNA traces found of Joshua's body, along with long strands of pure white hair. I couldn't think of what to say. I just sat silently, looking at the report. The hair was about the right length and color to belong to the albinos, but how could that possibly be? You're welcome, R hummed, standing up before leaving my office. Left alone with my thoughts, I felt my stomach turn over. I'd seen the reports from the other crime scene, the boy lying in a pool of his own blood and brain tissue, clasping a small revolver in one hand. It could have been the lack of sleep. Things no longer added up in that case. Nothing made any sense to me. Theories buzzed and nagged at me. What if the death was faked? What if the body was stolen? What if... I stood up quickly, holding my head before groaning. The dead don't walk around, Harrison. Get a grip. My lack of sleep was clearly apparent now. Pushing the files into my desk drawer, I headed home, annoyed at R but also deeply puzzled. My alarm did little to wake me the next morning, although the pounding at my door did. Sharon, who was far too peppy for this time of day, had just gotten news that the laptop's files had now been copied and were free to read. I hurriedly got myself dressed, then left to join her. On the way in, she told me that they had found a full electronic journal, with the last entry being the day of Joshua's death. She was hopeful that this could be our route to finishing the case. Even if it was lacking detail, it could shine some light on the story leading up to the young man's death. Sharon pretty much sprinted to my office, where a hard copy of the journal had been placed. Instantly, she fumbled for the last entry. I, slower at my age, arrived just as she found the page. Sitting down in my own chair, I took out a notepad and waited for Sharon to read what it said. Okay, March 26th. She paused to find her words before a very puzzled look crossed her face. What's wrong? I asked. Nothing. Let me just read it. I could tell she was composing herself. Taking a breath, she started to read. I know God must be smiling upon me. My prayers have been answered, and I have him back. Robbed from me. I'd given up hope that we could be one again. But we will be. He doesn't know what he is now, but I don't care. He's an angel now. The moonlight shows his true form. It scared me at first, but I know this was meant to be. I'll become part of him. I lie with him now as I type this. His skin is so cold and pure, like snow. He's yet to wake up from last night. He bit him pretty badly from animal instinct. But he's starving. My angel is starving. Tonight I'm not going to fight him. We can make a thing of it before his mind is taken by the moonlight. If anyone finds this, finds me, just know that I wanted this. I wanted to save my angel from his hunger. There was just silence left between Sharon and me as she finished reading. Slowly, she placed the papers down, looking a little ill. He let this person kill him. What in the world was he going on about? An angel. Pulling my gaze away, I stumbled upon the file I recognized from last night. I bit my tongue, then struggled to form a sentence. I want to know everything. Who Joshua knew and who his friends were, those who went missing and those he moved apart from. In reality, I felt numb. This couldn't be real, could it? Sharon was as confused and disturbed as I was. Yes, Harrison. But what do you think he's talking about? He doesn't seem to be stable, I mean. The way he talks here is... well, it's odd to say the least. What in the hell was going on? I remained silent for a while. I don't know. I'm going to ask around town and see if I can learn anything. I paused. Alone. Sharon just nodded, knowing I was as perplexed as she was about the whole business. Taking my coat, I left, planning on walking over to R's place to chat with him, to see if he could talk some sense into me. The walk across town was long and laborious, and I held my head down for most of the way. Moving my way through the waves of people, I drew closer to the building where R worked. The sense of dread that had hung over me ever since last night, which had strengthened after reading the journal, felt so much greater now. The face and form of the young white-haired man was etched into my mind. I quickened my step onwards. Pushing the door of the clinic open, I started to head over to the front desk to call for R, but that was when I saw him. Alone and sitting on the furthest most chair from the door sat a young boy. His clothes were tattered, his hair long and white. He looked like a ghost. His skin was marble. I felt a sharp inhale of air enter my chest. Harrison, what are you doing here? R called, walking around the corner. I snapped from my trance and grabbed his arms, trying to get him to listen. There, look there, As I turned to point to the boy, I saw that the chair was empty, as though I'd simply imagined him. R gave me a puzzled look. A chair? His accent sounded a little stronger than normal as he muttered, Are you okay? No words came out of my mouth, but I nodded, letting go of R. Let's get you some coffee and give you a place to sit down, okay? Without waiting for a response, R led me into a small conference room and got me to sit, before walking off to get some coffee for both of us. Taking long breaths, I tried to control myself. Don't let the stresses get to you. I tried to breathe slowly. Perhaps this was just a stress-related episode, but the only thing I could think about was Joshua and his killer, who in my mind was the white-haired teen. Before long, R came back, a folder under his arms, along with 2 steaming hot cups of coffee. I knew the man had an addiction to coffee and would offer or accept it at any opportunity. Passing me my mug, I felt myself start to relax, even before I started to drink. R sat across from me, placed his work down, then also started to drink. What happened out there? He asked after a short pause. I don't know. I think the stress is getting to me. I responded flatly, hardly concentrating. R sighed, then smiled. How old are you, Harrison? You're in your 60s now. Shouldn't you be living at home with your wife retired? I glared at him for a moment. Doctor's orders. You need to rest, Harrison. Look, I know you enjoy this, and your wife likes you to keep busy, but this job, this style of life, really isn't too good for you considering. My face softened and I nodded a little. This case in particular, why don't you leave it to Sharon and the other boys at the station? They're all up to solving it. I just don't think you should be working with a case like this. Not after, well, you know. I've accepted what happened, R, and I don't want to retire. This job keeps my mind working. No, it doesn't, Harrison. I can see it in your eyes. I'm saying this not as a doctor, but as your friend. You should stay with your wife and rest for a few weeks. R's voice had gotten softer. He knew my wife's time was short now. Finally, I nodded and agreed. For hours, I just chatted with R about life. Looking back, I guess I did need to cut down my work hours and spend more time with my lovely wife. Night was falling as I started to walk home. People were buzzing around, migrating back to their homes from their long work days. I felt better about life, more relaxed. Passing by shop fronts and restaurants, I started to instinctively look at people, blocking out the bad images with nicer ones. A couple were courting in the park under the old oak tree. One of the town's resident homeless was sitting at a bus stop with his large headphones on, tapping his foot in time with an unknown song. A proud giant of a man was walking home with his young son, carrying a bag of football kit. A young woman in a blue dress was exiting a small store named Transformer. I reassessed her gender shortly after. I found myself smiling, feeling the tensions of the case melt away. A girl selling roses, a man going to work at a restaurant, a white-haired teen in a light purple jumper looking over at me with dead blue eyes. I stopped abruptly and looked back. The teen had gone again, vanished into the crowds. My mouth felt dry. This was just stress, right? I quickened my steps, feeling my body pump with adrenaline. A cab sitting at red lights, a scruffy man walking down back streets. The white-haired boy again, his neck purple like it was bruised. I walked faster still. The sky was orange as the sun set. The building to my right had 5 floors. The dumpster around the corner house, 3 bin bags. The white-haired boy again, his face wet from tears, and pure white hair stained crimson. My eyes darted forward, away from the crowds, and fell on him again. One eye was golden and seemed to be ruptured, while the other was soft blue. His body looked so cold. I staggered back, but he'd vanished again, in the blink of an eye. Panicked, I started to run to the warmth of my home, my whole body shaking now. Breathless, I flew down my small street and fumbled for my keys before pushing the door open. Inside, I tried to catch my breath, taking lungful after lungful of air. Exhaling heavily and looked around. The money pot that stood on a small table by the doorway to the living room was smashed on the floor. So too was one of the lamps, a picture frame, keys. I felt as if time had stopped as I became aware of the sound of erratic breathing and gasping. I ran around the corner into my living room where I saw my wife convulsing on the floor. Her eyes were unfocused, one half of her face slumped to the side, her mouth half open. She was having another stroke. Lunging forward, I went to take her into my arms. But that was then I saw it. So, hungry, he murmured, one soft blue eye locked on my wife. He was thin, pale, cold. Moonlight poked its head out from behind the clouds for a moment, showing his true nature. Vast wings of pure light and a halo. Bloody white claws on both his hands and feet. Bloody neck, head and mouth, adorned with hundreds of sharp teeth. As soon as the clouds covered the moon again, he reverted back to the corpse he was. My eyes were locked on it. The angel of death that sat and watched as my wife died. It was as if something had taken over the body of a young man and now wore his skin, like a well-fitting glove. "What are you?" I screamed. Its eyes remained fixed on my wife, stiller now, hungry, starving. I turned to my wife, taking her in my arms. This seemed to confuse the angel, puppeteering the body it called home. It moved towards me and my wife. The moon shone on it again. The smell of rot was stagnant in the room. "Get back!" It didn't listen, simply moved closer, licking its long claws. "I want it." For a split second it vanished out of sight, and my world went dark. I awoke to a pounding pain in the back of my head. I forced myself upright before promptly clasping a hand over my mouth at what I saw. The starving angel was crouched over my wife's body, or what was left of it, pulling away at the chest mindlessly, pushing flesh and muscle into its mouth. I thought I would vomit, but grabbing for my handgun, I took aim. His dead eyes looked at me through bloody white hair, not seeming to know or care what I was doing. "Get off her!" I screamed, before shooting all 5 rounds into its head. To my horror, the angel took every single one, reactionless. Every bullet fell back out the hole it had made, bringing a pungent smell of rot with it, before closing up. Though it was futile, I continued to click the trigger of my gun, though nothing came out. I shouted and screamed, but it just continued to eat. The neighbors arrived a short time later, reporting that they found me with the body of my wife, crying and screaming at monsters. Sharon and the rest of the police force arrived shortly after and took me to hospital and my wife to the morgue. No trace of the angel was found, but I know what I saw. I saw him at the funeral, at the side of my wife's grave, by the roadside, watching the world and all its death. Since that night, I've retired from the police force and live alone. Stress is causing me heart problems, and R keeps warning me I could have a heart attack if I continue to live the way I do. But I know I don't have much time left anyway, since the angel is back, and he keeps telling me he's hungry. I lie awake at night, the glow of his wings illuminating my room. If there is a God, he is nothing more than the monsters he has created. I can feel my chest getting tight as my heart fails me. I watch as the starving angel lifts his head and watches me with hunger in its eyes.
Breaking the line. I don't know how long I was held in my watery prison. A month, a year, a decade. There was no way for me to measure time. 2 years before my death, I committed a terrible crime, and now I was suffering an ironic punishment courtesy of the demonic being who controlled this hellish realm. I'd been subjected to their twisted test, but the results were inconclusive, and so I'd been sent here to a sealed car at the bottom of a dark lake, left to rot while they considered my fate. I'd done everything I could think of to escape this hell, kicking against the windscreen until my leg ached, attempting to tear through the upholstery on the back seat, and trying to dismantle the car's interior with my bare hands. I worked frantically for hours until my hands were raw and bloody, but then I blinked, and everything was back to the way it was. I tried to end it all on a couple of occasions, smashing my head against the dashboard as I sought to crack my skull open. But it didn't matter how severely I injured myself. The same thing happened every time. I could not die, and whenever I regained consciousness, all my injuries were miraculously healed. They say hell is other people, but for me it was the tedium and loneliness. In the end, I gave up on all attempts at suicide or escape, and all I had was my thoughts. I don't know how long it took for my sanity to go. I would stare into the dark waters for hours or even days on end, and I started to see things, hideous monsters swimming along the bottom of the lake, glaring at me through the darkness with predatory eyes, and hungrily anticipating any opportunity to devour my flesh. There were times I would have gladly allowed the beasts to end me, but the glass between us was impenetrable. Other times I swore I got a glimpse of something in my rear mirror, jumping at the sight of a ghostly face in the back seat. Sometimes it was my ex-girlfriend Sally, other times my victim Milo, and on occasion I saw the dark-suited demon who had banished me here, an entity with swirling vortex-like eyes, who scared me more than any other horror. Was I going mad, or were the demons just fucking with me? I couldn't tell, and ultimately I hardly even cared. All I wanted was for this hell to end. But as time passed, I began to lose hope, fearing that the demons had forgotten about me, and I'd be trapped here for all eternity. Therefore, I can't tell you the shock I experienced when, with the mere blink of an eye, I was transported to another place. My heart jumped as I looked through the cracked windscreen and saw the road ahead. I was still in the car, but the vehicle was no longer at the bottom of that cursed lake. Instead, the car was on an abandoned, narrow road at night, surrounded by darkened forest on either side, with the only illumination coming from the vehicle's headlights. I panicked, fearing I would drive off the road and into a tree. But nothing happened when I grabbed hold of the steering wheel and put my foot down on the brake. I had no control over the vehicle, which appeared to be self-driving. Taking a deep breath, I sat back in my seat and observed my new environment, realizing I was entirely helpless and at the whim of whatever hellish entity had me in their grasp. The car drove for what seemed like miles, the road twisting and cutting deeper into the dark and foreboding forest. I tried to focus on the road, fearing what I would see beyond the tree line, but on occasion I couldn't help but glance into the black abyss. When I did so, I swore I could see shadows moving through the woods, unidentified creatures with burning red eyes that watched me closely as I progressed through their dark realm. The road reminded me of the line, the queue of damned souls trapped between the light and the vortex. If that had been my first test, was this my second? If not, what the hell was the point of it? I soon got an answer, of sorts. My possessed car turned a corner and I came face to face with a horrific scene. There was another car parked on the side of the road, identical to the one I was in. That's not to say it was the same make and model, but rather an exact carbon copy, right down to the cracked windscreen and dent in the hood. My jaw dropped as my headlights illuminated two darkened figures at the rear of the parked vehicle, loading what was clearly a body into the trunk. The first was my doppelganger, an exact double, at first glance at least. And the second figure was Sally, my ex-girlfriend and accomplice in this crime. I was revisiting my worst moment, the night I killed Milo in a drunken hit-and-run and conspired with Sally to make his body disappear. I continued watching the ghoulish reenactment play out as my vehicle drove past the crash site. My doppelganger and the copy of Sally ignored my car until the last second, when they looked up and met my gaze, their eyes jet black like those of a shark. I turned away in shocked horror, focusing on the road as my car kept on driving. I couldn't look back, but this leg of my journey was almost complete. The forest on the right-hand side of the road gave way to a body of dark water, one which I recognized all too well. My heart sank as I feared the puppet masters would send me back to the lake's bottom. But this wasn't what happened. I spotted a boathouse by the lake's side, with a dim light emanating from within the wooden structure, and suddenly the car came to a stop by the side of the road, about 20 or 30 yards short of the boathouse. I heard a sudden click and was astonished to realize the car's doors were now unlocked. I couldn't quite believe that they were releasing me from my prison, and part of me feared a trick. I wanted time to consider my next move, but the situation quickly deteriorated. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, turning my head in time to see a large humanoid creature launching itself from the top branches of a tree, unveiling a large pair of wings as it screeched loudly and took flight. The shadowy monster disappeared from my line of sight for a moment, but then there was a heavy crash on top of my car as the creature landed. I screamed as the winged beast shrieked in excitement and started clawing at the roof. The creature was powerful, and its claws were more than capable of cutting through metal. I knew it wouldn't be long before it broke through, and I only had one chance. Opening the driver's door with a shaking hand, I jumped out of the car and started to run. I shouldn't have looked back over my shoulder, but couldn't help myself. The beast was a winged, gargoyle-like creature with an impressive wingspan, large and pointed ears, and burning demonic eyes. It continued to claw at the car's roof for a moment, unaware that I'd already escaped. But the beast soon realized its mistake, wailing like a banshee as it shot me a murderous glare, unveiled its wings, and took off. I kept on running, sprinting as fast as my legs would carry me. There was only one place I could go, the boathouse. I didn't think I'd make it, but somehow I covered the distance whilst the screeching beast raced towards me. I saw the door of the boathouse lying open and made straight for it, leaping the last few yards as the gargoyle descended, its claws only inches from my back. I landed heavily on the hardwood floor, darting up and slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't expect this to stop the beast, but to my astonishment, I watched through the door's portal-type window as the wailing gargoyle withdrew, flapping its wings as it retreated back towards the treetops. Breathing a deep sigh of relief, I turned around to face a fresh horror as I surveyed my surroundings. The interior of the boathouse took the form of a run-down dive bar, complete with sawdust on the floor and the stench of split alcohol and something much fouler. It was dark and dilapidated inside of the bar, and this certainly wasn't the type of venue I would have frequented during my drinking days. Nevertheless, the unpleasant interior of the bar room didn't concern me, at least not as much as the terrifying and familiar figure standing behind the bar. I stood frozen in awestruck horror as I observed the demonic entity casually cleaning glasses behind a blood-red counter and with a bar stacked with label-less green bottles. He looked up when he saw me, his impossible vortex-like eyes placing me in a trance as I found myself under his dark spell. He formed his lips into a smile of sorts, although it certainly didn't put me at ease. And then he spoke in a deep, almost godlike voice. "Ah, Joshua, I'm so glad you could make it. You must be thirsty after your journey. Let me offer you a drink. On the house, of course." I was puzzled by the shadow man's words and unconvinced by his supposedly amicable welcome. The last time I'd spoken with this demon, he'd confined me to my watery prison, warning me that a far worse fate could await me. Naturally, I was terrified of the entity and wanted nothing to do with him. I certainly didn't want to accept a drink from this demon. Nevertheless, I was now entirely under the shadow man's control, and before I knew it, I was slowly walking towards the bar, my feet moving even though my brain was screaming, "Stop." I reached the bar but didn't dare to look into the shadow man's swirling and bewitching eyes. I kept my head down, focusing on the demon's accumulated dinner suit and bow tie, watching his bony hands as he grabbed 2 glasses and an unidentified green bottle from the top shelf. "Scotch on the rocks. That's your poison, right?" he asked. I opened my trembling lips, struggling to speak in response. I don't... But he didn't give me the chance to finish as he carefully poured 2 glasses of smooth whiskey and pushed them across the bar towards me. "Here you go, Joshua. 1 large whiskey for you, and the same for your friend over there." His bony finger pointed to the corner of the room, and I turned to face the figure sitting alone in a darkened booth, his head raised as he stared back at me. My heart beat fast in my chest, and my body trembled, but I can't say I was surprised. The dark eyes glaring towards me belonged to Milo, the man I'd killed 2 years ago before conspiring with Sally to dispose of his body. The last time I saw him, Milo was being dragged into the Shadowlands by a gang of bloodthirsty demons. I felt sure they would rip him to shreds, but yet here he was, sitting in the bar room and apparently waiting for me. I hesitated for a long moment as we locked eyes. I didn't want to go to Milo, but I couldn't run away from this. I'd done this man a great wrong, and now I needed to make amends, or at least attempt to do so. I took a deep breath, putting my head down as I walked across the sawdust-covered floor, my hands shaking as I struggled to keep hold of the 2 glasses. As I got closer, I could see Milo's mangled face, his forehead still covered in dried blood as it had been the last time I saw him. When Milo previously confronted us in the line, he'd attempted to throttle Sally and me in a mad fit of rage. I wondered whether he still desired revenge against me. I couldn't blame Milo if he did, but there was no way of predicting the ghoul's intentions from his cold, emotionless eyes. I stood over the table for a long moment, meeting his gaze and resisting the urge to recoil in disgust at his gruesome injuries. The tension was almost unbearable, and I found myself unable to speak. In the end, it was Milo who broke the silence, as he said, "Take a seat, Joshua." He pointed to the wooden bench on the opposite side of the table. I hesitated for only a second before sitting down and placing the 2 glasses on the table. Milo nodded his head before using his twisted right hand to awkwardly pick up his glass and hold it aloft. "Now then, Josh, how about taking a drink with me?" My jaw dropped as I looked down at the glass before me, feeling sick as I smelt the strong brown liquor contained within it. I glanced up at Milo's dead eyes, shaking my head vigorously as I spluttered out my response. I don't drink Milo. I gave up after—" "What?" Milo interjected impatiently. "You gave up the booze after killing me while drunk driving? Well, that hardly matters now, does it?" I broke eye contact with the ghoul, struggling to control my emotions as I continued staring at the glass. "I can't," was my pathetic reply. "I'm afraid I must insist, Joshua," answered Milo, as his tone suddenly turned hostile. I looked up and saw his pale and emaciated face screwed up with anger. I knew from previous experience how quickly Milo could lose his temper, and so submitted to his wishes, grasping my glass with a shaking hand and raising it up to meet that of my unlikely companion. "Cheers!" Milo exclaimed more amicably as he clinked his glass against mine. I watched as he downed his drink in one, pouring it down the gaping black hole that was his mouth. I paused for a second before following suit, coughing as the hard liquor forced its way down my throat. But then something extraordinary occurred. I felt a raw energy flowing through my veins, a burst of adrenaline which cut through my dread and gave me a renewed confidence and hope. And then I looked across the table and saw Milo transformed. He was no longer a mangled walking corpse. Instead, Milo was restored to his former self, the young, vibrant man he'd been before the accident and his untimely death. I was astonished and once again left speechless, but Milo simply smiled and shot me a wink as he said, "I think it's high time we had a heart-to-heart, don't you, Josh?" I nodded my head vigorously as tears welled up in my eyes. "I really am so sorry, Milo," I whimpered emotionally. I knew how inadequate my apology was, but Milo's reaction surprised me. "I know you're sorry, Joshua, but we're past that now." He sighed deeply, staring longingly at his now empty glass before continuing. "I'm guessing you have a lot of questions, and you're not going to get any answers from him." He nodded over to the shadow man who continued to wipe down glasses behind the bar, apparently disinterested in our conversation. "You know what's happening here, Milo?" I asked, feeling an unsettling sense of déjà vu as I did so. "I believe I have the answers you need," he answered cryptically. He let that statement hang in the air for a moment. Meanwhile, I felt like my brain was on fire. I had so many questions it was difficult to know where to start, so I returned to the events of our last meeting. "I saw you die," I muttered nervously. "The demons took you." Milo shot me a sly half-smile before replying. "I was already dead, remember? The demons can hurt us. They can rip you to pieces. But you always come back. You pass out from the pain, and when you regain consciousness, you're right back where you started. That's the true hell, Joshua. To know there's no peace, no final release from all the pain and the fear." He broke eye contact, looking down at his empty glass and perhaps wishing it would magically refill. His words chilled me, but I reckoned Milo must be telling the truth. Still, there was so much I didn't understand. "The line," I said firmly. "I thought it was about salvation, about who makes it to paradise and who gets dragged to hell. But it wasn't that simple, was it?" Milo raised his head, appearing thoughtful for a moment as he looked over at the bar. There was a lengthy pause before he eventually replied. It wasn't about salvation, but rather redemption. The purpose was to test us, to see how we'd react when backed against a wall. He turned to face me, a fiery intensity in his eyes as he spoke to me in a serious tone. You've got to understand something, Joshua. The three of us are tied together. Ever since you ran me down that night, our fates have been intertwined. We three were tested in the line, and we all fell short. I shook my head in confusion. Perhaps I'm not the brightest, but none of this made any sense to me. I can understand why Sally and I were punished, I exclaimed. But why you, Milo? You were the wronged party. True, Milo answered with a nod. But my test was forgiveness, and I failed completely. I let hatred and a desire for revenge pollute my soul, and for that I'm sorry. I looked into his dark eyes with astonishment, not believing what I'd just heard. Milo was sorry for not forgiving me? I reckoned he had good cause to bear a grudge, but I guess that's not how it works in the afterlife. But still, I clearly wasn't the good guy in this story, and I had wronged Milo, not once, but twice. I failed in the line. I admitted, I should have made amends, but instead I threw you to the demons. Milo sighed deeply before replying, swallowing an old bitterness that he was trying hard to put behind him. Yes, you failed on that score, but you did what was necessary to save Sally. You sacrificed yourself for her. That's the only reason you're not in hell right now. An ice-cold chill ran through me as I realized how close I'd come to eternal damnation. But this left me with an obvious question. What about Sally? I asked sheepishly. Where is she? Milo nodded ominously, like he'd been anticipating this very question. Sally is in a bad place right now, but she's not beyond redemption. We can help her. Correction. We must help her. I thought Milo was joking, but when I looked him in the eye, I saw he was deadly serious. But why would Milo want to help Sally? She was my ex-girlfriend, the woman I'd once loved with all my heart. But my feelings towards her now were complicated. I didn't like the idea of her suffering, but couldn't forget how she'd behaved in the line, playing us both to save her own skin. I thought about concealing this fact from Milo, but there'd been too many lies already. You know she lied, I muttered. She lied to you, Milo. He didn't seem surprised by this revelation, and his reply confused me even further. Sally lied about some things, but not about everything, he replied. What do you mean? I asked in puzzlement. Milo screwed up his face like he didn't understand my question. You don't remember how you died? He inquired cautiously. My brain ached as I desperately tried to think. I'd spent so long inside that damned car trying to recall the details of my death. There were fleeting memories, but nothing solid. As hard as I tried, I couldn't fill in the gaps. I remember being in a car, was my eventual and uncertain reply. I think I was in an accident? Milo looked visibly sad in that moment, as if he genuinely felt sympathy for me. You weren't in a car accident, he confirmed, but don't worry about that now. We've got to go. Go where? I asked, as my frustration grew. Go to get Sally. Milo replied firmly, she needs our help. And I promise you, Joshua, you'll find the answers you seek on our journey. Suddenly, Milo stood up from his chair and started walking towards the bar, briefly turning his head to look at me before he proceeded. I continued to sit in the booth, confused and uncertain, but realizing Milo wanted me to follow him. I was frightened by what lay ahead, yet I didn't want to stay here in limbo. I cast a glance towards the shadow man, avoiding the swirling orbs he had in the place of eyes. I didn't know whether I could trust Milo, but I sure as hell didn't want to stay here with him. And so, I stood up on shaking legs and cautiously followed in Milo's footsteps. I deliberately avoided the shadow man's gaze as I walked, but noted how he casually returned to the menial task of wiping down the bar top while seemingly ignoring us both. But, as Milo and I passed the bar, he called out amicably to us, saying, "Good luck, gentlemen." Milo made for the back exit behind the bar, placing his fingers on the door handle before turning his head to face me, his expression still deadly serious as he delivered a stern warning. "Just remember one thing, Joshua. We have a specific mission, and we can't get distracted. We are both tied to Sally, and she's the one we're going in to save. We will encounter other lost souls during our odyssey, just like we did in the line. But we can't save them. They're all fighting their own battles, and will find their own way in the end. Understand?" I nodded my head, even though I didn't fully comprehend the rules. I didn't know what lay ahead of me, but had little choice but to follow Milo's lead. We exited through the solid oak door and were instantly hit by a stifling heat and heavy rain that fell upon our heads. It was still nighttime, but the vast body of water before us was dimly illuminated by the pale moonlight. But what drew my attention was the substantial island which sat to our north, upon which was built a medieval castle, with high defensive walls and a round tower easily 100 feet in height. I stared at that distant tower for a long moment, focusing on a dim light in a high-up window. I can't quite describe my feelings as I look upon that burning light. I'd been in many tough spots and witnessed many horrors, but I sensed there was an absolute evil inside of that tower, a monstrosity beyond my meager imagination, and it was watching us. I don't know how I knew this, but somehow I did. This dark entity was closely monitoring our progress through its realm, and it surely didn't welcome our presence here. I stood frozen under the biting rain, unable to divert my gaze from the ominous tower. I was conscious of a far-off storm that appeared to be heading in our direction, with distant thunder and flashes of lightning assaulting my senses. All my instincts told me to turn and run, but Milo gave me strength, grabbing my arm firmly and forcing me to look him in the eye. "We need to get to the island," he said firmly. "We've got to do this. For Sally." "For Sally," I repeated uncertainly as I looked away from the horizon and followed my unlikely ally down the slope leading to the lakeside. I saw a jetty leading out into the dark water. It appeared all too familiar, but I tried not to dwell on this. At the end of the dock was a small rowboat piloted by a dark figure clad from head to toe in black robes, his face hidden by a hood which covered his head. Milo walked down the jetty and towards the waiting boat, but naturally I hesitated, glaring suspiciously at the hooded figure as I questioned his intentions. Milo turned to face me, visually sighing as he noted my hesitation. "Come on, man," he exclaimed, raising his voice to be heard over the downpour. "This is the only way to cross the water." I took a deep breath before proceeding. We took our places on board the small boat, and I tried my hardest not to look at the hooded pilot as we cast off. I dreaded to imagine what he had hidden underneath his hood. I don't know how the boat propelled itself. We weren't rowing and there was no visible engine, but yet we moved steadily across the dark lake, slowly getting closer to the cursed isle. The lake's surface was bombarded by raindrops, but otherwise the water was still, at least at first. I looked down at the dark water and saw the first ripples. As yet unidentified creatures began to rise from the depths. I gasped when I saw the first of them, a rotting corpse, somehow still living despite the skin and flesh falling from its body. The zombie-like creature stank to high heaven, its dead eyes full of rage and hunger as it focused upon our boat and furiously swam towards us. I feared what the ghoul would do to us, but a moment later, a second corpse broke through to the surface, promptly attacking the first. Soon, the two zombies were tearing at each other with their bare hands and nails, roaring like wild animals, and slowly dismembering each other until the rotting remains sank beneath the surface, This scene was soon replicated across the lake and on all sides of our little boat, as dozens of moaning zombies emerged and violently fought against each other, ripping bodies to shreds and filling the lake with blood. A few managed to fight their way through the scrum of bodies, desperately approaching our boat with their arms outstretched. But our hooded pilot soon saw them off, hissing like a cat and scaring the dead, forcing them back underneath the water. After a while, I no longer feared the zombies. Instead, I pitied them. But I remembered Milo's words. We couldn't help these people and had to focus on our mission. Thankfully, we soon navigated through the Lake of the Dead, although our situation certainly didn't improve once we reached the island. The pilot would not land on the shore, and so we were forced to wade through the shallows to get to the beach. I didn't look back as the boat left us behind. We climbed the steep, muddy slope up from the beach, climbing to the top where we witnessed the monstrous castle in all its terrible glory. The high and thick walls were surrounded by a defensive moat, with a drawbridge allowing us to cross. The heavy gates lay open, but the castle was far from undefended. I looked up to the top of the walls, horrified to see winged monsters perched on the turrets, glaring down at us with murderous intent in their red, glowing eyes. I recognized the beasts, noting their close resemblance to the monster who'd attacked me in the forest. Except now there were many of them, 13 at my quick count, all watching us closely as we advanced towards the drawbridge. As always, I followed Milo's lead, but I sensed that he too was scared, noting how his body trembled as he avoided looking at the gargoyles. We reached the drawbridge and began walking across, our boots thumping on wooden planks as we struggled not to slip on the soaking wet surface. I made the mistake of looking down into the deep moat. In the dark waters below, I saw snapping beasts, trapped predators who surely sensed our presence above them, no doubt hoping Milo and I would slip and fall, so they could feast upon our warm flesh. But the unidentified monsters at the bottom of the moat weren't our primary concern. We were halfway across the bridge when we heard a terrifying screeching from above us. I fearfully glanced up in time to see several of the gargoyles taking off from the castle walls, extending their wings as they soared down towards us, their razor-sharp claws extended and their red eyes burning with a predatory zeal. "Run!" Milo screamed, as his cool demeanor broke down. I didn't need to be told twice, as I sprinted towards the castle's gate with Milo by my side, but I didn't think we'd make it. The lead gargoyle was only a few feet above me, wailing like a banshee as it prepared to dig its claws into my back. But suddenly I saw a projectile flying through the air, turning to watch as the bolt hit the winged monster in its right leg. The gargoyle shrieked in pain, abandoning its attack as it retreated, flying upwards and back to the safety of the battlements above. A moment later, a second bolt was fired, striking another monster and penetrating its pale flesh. Before long, all the gargoyles were retreating, aborting their assault under fire. I turned my head, looking back across the moat to see our savior. The figure illuminated by the moonlight was instantly recognizable, even though he had taken on a different form. The vortex-like orbs he had instead of eyes were a dead giveaway. It was the Shadow Man, except now he'd traded his tuxedo for a suit of armor and his bar rag for a crossbow. He nodded at me as he lowered his weapon, and I nodded back in thanks, although in truth I was very confused. For so long I'd believed this entity was my enemy, committed to punishing me for my sins. But now he'd saved us both. I looked to Milo, and I guess he read my mind, because he promptly offered me an explanation. He offers us protection, but it has its limits. We are permitted entry to the castle, but we'll need to work quickly. If we can't save Sally in time, all three of us will be trapped here forever. I stared at Milo in astonishment. How could he have kept this from me? What else did he know that he wasn't telling me? I was angry and scared, but also filled with a fiery determination. It's difficult to explain, but for so long my existence had been empty and without purpose. But now I had a mission, a chance at redemption. I was beginning to understand what Milo meant. I felt it deep inside of me, realizing that the three of us were tied together in death. We had to find Sally and bring her home. It was our only chance to avoid eternal damnation. We entered the gates without further incident, the wounded gargoyles cackling in annoyance as they watched us from the battlements. Once again, Milo led the way as we negotiated a series of narrow, twisting alleyways and advanced further into the castle's interior. My companion knew the way, and so I assumed he'd been here before. But Milo was clearly far from comfortable in this environment, his cool composure now gone as he frantically darted from shadow to shadow in an apparent attempt to remain unseen. I followed in his footsteps, noting how the rain had become even heavier, to the point where it physically hurt when it hit my skin. The storm was closer now, too, with the din of thunder near deafening and the lightning temporarily illuminating the tight alleyways before they returned to darkness. I occasionally glanced upwards at the foreboding tower which dominated the skyline, but I couldn't bear to look upon it for long. I could only hope that the evil which dwelled within was incapable of leaving. But the intensity of the weather and urgency of Milo's actions were concerning, to say the least. But before long, we emerged into an avenue at the foot of the tower and witnessed a horrifying scene. As the rain poured down, a line of lost souls trudged grimly through the puddles. Clad in soaked rags, their feet were bare and bodies emaciated. All their heads were down, and not one of the damned souls spoke or even acknowledged our presence in their hell. There was an obvious difference between this line and the one I'd previously experienced. All of the souls were moving constantly, albeit slowly, but they were literally going nowhere. The damned slowly walked the cobblestones on one side of the street before reaching the end of the cul-de-sac, at which point they turned around and walked down the other side. Turning again before repeating the process, they were walking in a circle and seemed to have been doing so for a long time. The waterlogged, cobblestoned street was surrounded on three sides by stone houses with open, glassless windows, and at the far end, dominating the entire avenue, was the round tower, home to God knows what. I shouldn't have done so, but I creaked my head upwards, looking at the flame burning on the top story of the tower. I only looked for a second, but observed a dark figure staring down at me. Its appearance was little more than a shadow set against a burning torch, but the mere sight of this entity provoked a chilling, primal terror deep within me, a fear which paralyzed me until Milo shook me back to reality, forcing me to look away. "Don't fucking do that!" he screamed frantically, his eyes filled with something close to madness. "Don't look at it, not even for a moment." We joined the line, pushing in between two damned souls who did not object. But as we passed by the row of stone houses, we bore witness to the true horror. Inside each small house, visible and exposed through the open windows, were blood-stained torture chambers filled with screaming, moaning victims. I saw naked bodies strung up by chains, strapped down to racks, and forced into Iron Maidens and other vile torture devices. And the torturers were foul demons, snarling, pale-skinned humanoids with hateful eyes and sharp claws that they gleefully used to slice into flesh and bone, cutting deep into their screaming victims without even a hint of mercy. I looked into the bloodshot eyes of the torture victims and saw nothing but pain, fear, and madness. I thought about trying to help them, but knew I couldn't. Milo had been clear on this, and so I looked away, trying in vain to ignore the screams and the awful sound of claws cutting through flesh. We joined the grim procession under the heavy rain as the thunderstorm closed in around us. We walked around in a circle 5 times, my nerves on edge as I felt myself slip to the edge of madness. I wondered why the others continued this endless, pointless march, but then I discovered why. Suddenly, just in front of us, one of the damned collapsed, crying aloud as he dropped to his knees. "I can't take it anymore," he screamed whilst looking up into the storm clouds. But there was no mercy in this realm. The line was held up behind him, but not for long. I saw a burst of movement in the corner of my eye, turning in time to see a demon reaching out through the open window and grabbing hold of the man, digging its claws deep into his flesh. "No, please God, no," the victim screamed, but it was over quickly. The demon dragged the screaming man, pulling him through the window and into the torture chamber, where he would surely join the other victims in eternal torment. Not a single soul in the line had attempted to save him. In fact, the damned didn't even react to his abduction. They simply walked on as if nothing had happened, trudging through the puddles with their heads down. At this point, I saw this place for the hell it was. The first line I'd walked through was terrifying and violent, but there was still hope in that realm. Rightly or wrongly, those trapped there believed they could escape and reach a better place, but there was no hope in this line. Here, the damned walked in circles for all eternity without any chance of escape. They did so because the alternative was even worse. Those who fell would be dragged from the line and tortured by demons lurking inside the stone houses, subjected to pain and terror until madness overcame them. My heart sank, and I felt sick to my stomach. I now knew what this place was, but didn't understand what we were doing here. I put my hand on Milo's shoulder, making him turn his head as I shouted in his ear. "What the hell is this? You said we were here for Sally." "We are," Milo replied firmly. "Just wait." I was frustrated by yet another evasive answer, but trusted in Milo nonetheless. It was on our 13th circle of the street that the door suddenly shot open. I saw the entrance at the far end of the avenue, nothing how it was the only house on the street without windows, meaning we were unable to see whatever horrors occurred inside. I experienced a grim foreboding as we walked towards the dim candlelight, coming from the tiny house. But on some level, I knew that my destiny lay on the other side of that door. Whatever horror was inside was something I needed to face. The room we entered seemed comfortable at first. I was relieved to find sanctuary from the deluge. The smell inside was musky, but a vast improvement on the stinking corpses from the lake. The walls were bare, but there was an open fire burning in the corner, and I savored the warmth it provided. But what little comfort I felt was short-lived, because what we saw inside of that small room shook me to my very core. I spotted Milo staring blankly at the far corner of the room and slowly turned to face in that direction. My jaw dropped when I saw the woman sitting in a rocking chair, swinging back and forth whilst cradling a sobbing baby. Not a newborn, but a toddler aged about 1 or 1.5. I recognized the young woman straight away. It was Sally, the girl I'd once loved. I called out her name, but she did not respond. I was like she didn't even know we were there. Sally's brunette hair was tied back in a ponytail. Her face was drawn, and there were bags underneath her eyes. She looked exhausted, and yet her green eyes were full of joy and happiness as she comforted the child, singing a sweet lullaby as she gently rocked him back to sleep. I looked down at the baby boy in Sally's arms, and something clicked in my brain, but I still couldn't quite put the pieces together. I was desperately trying to think, but then a heartbreaking tragedy unfolded in front of my eyes. In a matter of seconds, the toddler's face drained of all color. His skin turned pale and then gray, before his tiny body dissolved into ash, literally falling apart in Sally's arms. But the true horror was my ex-girlfriend's reaction as Sally's world ended. She cried out the child's name as she collapsed to the floor. "Kevin, my baby boy, what have they done to you?" I saw the expression in her eyes turn from joy to devastation in a moment, and it was horrific. But what happened next was somehow even worse. In the blink of an eye, the previous scene was restored, as Kevin was brought back to life with Sally cradling him in her arms. She seemed to have no memory of the previous events, continuing to sing gently to the child while still ignoring the presence of Milo and me. But then the tragedy played out again, with Kevin disappearing into ash, while Sally cried out in pain. It was clear she was trapped in an eternal loop. This was her torture, to see the child under her care die in her arms over and over again, until she was eventually driven mad with grief. This was Sally's hell. The terrible truth should have been obvious, but still my brain couldn't quite connect the dots. There was a heavy roar of thunder from outside the open door which made me jump. The storm was right on top of us now, with the damned barely able to stand, let alone walk under the heavy wind and rain. I don't understand. Why is this happening? I asked, whilst looking to Milo. My companion lost all patience at this point, grabbing me roughly by the shoulders and shaking me vigorously as he screamed in my face. For fuck's sake, Joshua, we don't have time for this. Look at the child's face. Really look, and you'll see the truth. I did so, focusing on the boy's deep blue eyes, which were almost identical to my own. And then it finally clicked. A wave of emotions and memories came flooding back, and I remembered the painful truth. Kevin was my son. Sally had left me 2 years before. Our relationship couldn't survive the shared guilt over Milo's death. She'd moved to the other side of the country and broke off all contact. The breakup was devastating for me at the time, but I did try to move on with my life. But what I didn't know was that Sally was carrying my child, a son I would never meet. I now remembered the phone call I received from Sally's father one rainy afternoon. I could tell from the tone of his voice that it was bad news. Sally was dead, killed instantly when her car was hit at an intersection by a long-haul truck driver who'd fallen asleep at the wheel. She was killed instantly, as was Kevin, who was sitting on the child seat in the back. I attended the funeral, barely functioning as tears rolled down my cheeks, and I watched the 2 coffins being lowered into the ground, mother and son put to rest together. My grief was shared by Sally's parents, family, and friends, but I also felt an unbearable guilt, because I knew that Sally and Kevin would still be alive if it wasn't for the terrible mistake I'd made 2 years before. My life spiraled out of control immediately after the funeral. I started drinking again in an attempt to dull the pain, but it wasn't enough. I was plagued by nightmares of the accident that night, and of Sally and Kevin's terrifying final moments. I couldn't take it any longer. I did get into my car that night, but I didn't drive anywhere. My garage door was sealed shut when I turned on the engine, closing my eyes and allowing the toxic fumes to enter my lungs. I lost consciousness and slipped into eternal darkness, waking to find myself standing in the line, with almost no memory of the events which led to my death. I'd assumed Sally was lying when she spoke about our son, but this was only because I could not remember, as perhaps my brain had blocked out the trauma. Sally had changed some details, or perhaps her own memory was fuzzy. But now I could see her love for Kevin was genuine, and her grief at losing him was devastating. I was still trying to process this revelation when my attention was drawn to the outside. Suddenly, a powerful bolt of lightning struck the street directly outside. The bolt was so bright that it temporarily blinded me, and the impact shattered the cobblestones, breaking the ground wide open as a deep crevice emerged, quickly expanding in size as screaming souls fell inside, plummeting down into the darkness. The buildings on each side of the street began to collapse as the huge crack grew, coming ever closer to the house we occupied while swallowing up everything in its path. Milo grabbed my arm so tightly that it hurt, and he screamed in my ear loud enough to be heard over the chaos. "It's now or never, Joshua. You need to get through to her. Do it now, or we're all fucked." I nodded my head, taking a deep breath as I turned to face my ex-girlfriend. Sally was oblivious to all the chaos occurring around her, continuing to rock and sing to Kevin, even as the whole world collapsed down upon our heads. Sally should have been dealt with delicately, But there was no time for this. I grabbed her roughly by the shoulders, shaking her until she acknowledged my presence. She cried out, looking up whilst grasping a tighter hold of Kevin, pulling him closer to her bosom. She took a moment to recognize me, as my sudden appearance in her world was entirely unexpected. "Joshua," she muttered weakly. "Josh, is it really you?" I bit my lip, attempting to ignore the turmoil outside the door as I tried desperately to bring my ex back to reality. "Yes, Sally, it's me. Now listen." "Josh," she interjected, still oblivious to the situation developing around her. "I'm so sorry, Josh. I should have told you the truth. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong." She paused, looking down at the still crying toddler in her arms. "Josh, this is your son, our beautiful baby boy." Masonry and debris were falling from the ceiling above me, and Milo was screaming in my ear. I had run out of time. "Sally," I cried, "that is not our son." She opened her mouth in dismay, replying angrily through trembling lips. "How dare you, Joshua? How dare you say that? Sally, we have a son, but that's not him. This is all a trick. You need to snap out of it right fucking now." "Fuck you," she swore, whilst tightening her grip on the baby. I'd reached the end of my teether and decided that direct action was required. It broke my heart, but there was no other choice. I reached out, grabbing at Kevin and pulling with all my strength. Sally reacted predictably, crying out as she desperately fought against me. "No. What are you doing? Let go," she exclaimed in dismay. But I couldn't do this. The struggle lasted for mere seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Sally fought with all her strength, but I was able to pry the baby from her arms, although her maternal screams brought a chill down my spine. I held Kevin in my arms for a brief moment, before his skin went gray and his tiny body turned to ashes, slipping through my fingers and falling to the ground. This event finally woke Sally from her trance, her eyes widening as she surveyed her surroundings. "What the hell?" she exclaimed in confusion. "Where am I?" Then she looked to the doorway and her face froze with horror. "Oh my God," she swore. I turned my head and saw what she meant. The street outside had now vanished, falling into the ever-expanding sinkhole that was swallowing up everything in its path. And the small room we occupied was collapsing around us, the ground shaking as we dodged huge slabs falling from the ceiling. I looked into Milo's eyes and saw nothing but blind terror. I'd completed the task assigned to me, but was it already too late? We all feared the worst, as the storm raged and the earth cracked open, but suddenly I felt an intense heat on my back. Turning around, I saw a swirling vortex of blood red, identical to the one I'd been sucked into during my previous test. "Thank God," Milo exclaimed as he darted forward, leaping into the portal without a second's hesitation. I went to follow, knowing that whatever lay on the far side was surely better than here. But when I glanced across at Sally, I saw she was frozen to the spot, staring into the vortex with terror in her eyes. "I can't," she muttered fearfully. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," I shot back whilst grabbing hold of her hand and shooting her a reassuring smile. "We'll go together." She smiled back at me, and then we were running hand in hand, entering the vortex seconds before the ground collapsed. And then, the darkness consumed us. We're in a different place now. Not heaven or hell, but another version of purgatory, where we must remain until our sins are absolved. This prison takes the form of a rundown apartment block, set in the middle of a dark, monster-ridden hellscape. We are sealed inside of the building, and so are reasonably safe. Sally, Milo, and I are still bound together, forced to live on top of each other in this tiny flat. Our neighbors are a motley crew of bizarre individuals, all serving their own sentences for various sins committed in the mortal realm. The block warden is an odd man, helpful and friendly up to a point, although I sense a deep sadness in him and suspect he's on his own journey of redemption. This isn't a pleasant place to inhabit, and the three of us are often at each other's throats. But in a strange way, we three are like family now. And as bad as this complex can be, we know there are far worse realms we could be sent to. The Shadow Man continues to oversee us, communicating very occasionally through a one-way telephone installed in our apartment. We know there's still time to be served, and we're all willing to do so, if only because we have hope for the future. We may be dead, but we still have dreams. Milo is waiting for the wife he left behind, looking forward to their eventual reunion. As for Sally and me, our goal is to find our baby boy, to reach whatever level of the afterlife his innocent soul inhabits. When that day comes, we'll become the family we always should have been, and our past sins will be swept away.